Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault. Tonight we step into the dusty edge of America in the 1840s, where wagon wheels creak in the dark, and the road to Oregon begins before dawn has properly opened its eyes. You stand in Independence, Missouri, listening to oxen breathe steam into the cool air, while canvas covers stir like pale ghosts, and someone nearby drops a skillet with a clang that feels much too loud for this hour. Everything smells of wood smoke, leather, damp earth, and nerves. It is exciting, of course. It is also the kind of exciting that should make a sensible person lie down immediately and reconsider every life choice. Because, and let us be honest, you probably will not survive this in anything like comfort. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are here, tell me your location and local time. Now dim the lights and let the wagon start rolling in your mind. You are here because the Oregon Trail has become one of the great promises of the 19th century. Word travels east that the Willamette Valley is green, fertile, and worth every blister. By the early 1840s, emigrant parties really are making the trip in growing numbers. And after 1843 the route becomes a much more travelled road for overland settlers. That is the mainstream fact, the solid one, the sort that appears in every tidy overview. But standing here in Independence, none of it feels tidy. It feels like confusion tied up with rope. Around you people bargain, boast, whisper, and pretend they know exactly what lies ahead. Storefronts do brisk business, selling flour, bacon, coffee wagons, harness, and every miracle item guaranteed to keep a family alive for 2,000 miles. Men stand with one boot up on a barrel and announce opinions to anyone who will listen. Women measure bolts of cloth and quietly look over sacks of beans as if the right number can somehow protect children from fever. A boy chases a chicken between wagon tongues. Somewhere someone is already crying behind a wagon, though they're doing it politely with their face turned away. You notice how the town itself seems to lean westward. Independence is one of the main jumping-off places, along with places like St. Joseph later on, and it hums with that odd frontier energy where commerce and faith shake hands. Blacksmiths hammer rims onto wheels. Teamsters curse under their breath. A preacher offers a blessing to a cluster of families who nod very seriously while keeping one eye on a barrel of salted pork. Hope is in the air, yes, but so is salesmanship. The trail begins with confidence, and confidence is often just fear wearing clean a hat. Historians still argue whether most emigrants truly understood the scale of the journey before setting out, or whether they simply convinced themselves that other people had exaggerated the hardships. That debate lingers because the diaries tell two stories at once. Many travellers clearly prepared with care. Many also seem stunned only weeks in by how punishing ordinary travel could be. You can almost see the illusion being packed right beside the skillet and the extra boots. Your own wagon waits nearby, and even standing still it looks overworked. This is another surprise for modern minds. Most emigrants do not ride in the wagon all day like royalty in a rolling parlour. The wagon is for supplies, children when needed, the sick, the old, and the moments when someone simply cannot put one foot before the other. Most of the time you walk. It is one of those quiet betrayals of history. The wagon that fills every painting is in reality more like a travelling closet with opinions. The oxen are perhaps the only creatures present who seem unimpressed by human dreams. Their wide faces suggest deep moral disappointment. They will pull because they must not, because they believe in manifest destiny. And yes, that phrase is beginning to circulate in the wider culture, this idea that the United States is meant to spread westward. But at ground level, right here in the mud, grand national ideology looks less like a glowing future and more like a woman checking whether the flour barrel leaked overnight. A quirky little tidbit drifts through campfire talk before you have even left town. Some emigrants bring musical instruments, including fiddles and even small accordions, because apparently when faced with cholera, river crossings, and several months of outdoor sleeping, the human spirit still says, "You know what would improve this a tune after supper? It sounds absurd until you hear someone play a few soft notes in the evening. Then it sounds necessary. People do not carry music because the trip is easy. They carry it because it is not. You begin to notice the social sorting of the camp. Wealthier families may have slightly better wagons, more hired help, finer fabrics, maybe even more food packed into crates with irritating confidence. But the trail has a way of flattening status. Dust coats everyone. Sweat does not care about your former address. The banker from back east and the farm wife from Illinois both need water-dry socks and a place to close their eyes at night. Social history lives right here in these small equalities and stubborn inequalities. Some women still cook over the fire after a day on foot, while certain men discuss route strategy, as if supper appears by scholarly debate. Human nature then as now remains wonderfully predictable. You also sense who does not get included in the grand heroic version later told around parlours and in school books. There are single women, widows' hired hands, enslaved people in some parties, before Oregon itself becomes legally hostile to black settlement, and people whose names vanish from records as soon as the ink dries. There are native nations all along the land ahead, whose presence is very much real, even when emigrants speak as if they are entering emptiness. The trail is never through nothing. It is through someone's homeland, someone's trade route, someone's memory, even before departure routine begins to harden. Wagons are circled for convenience or caution, animals are checked, water barrels are inspected, bacon is counted again because no one trusts bacon to remain where it was put. Children are warned not to wander. A mother folds bedding with the precise motions of someone trying to fold control itself. A father studies a map that is not wrong exactly, just cheerfully incomplete. You can feel the journey assembling itself out of hundreds of small acts. Night in the jumping off camp is your first lesson in what this life will really be. You do not sleep in peace so much as in shifts of awareness. Someone coughs. A mule stamps. A baby fusses and is soothed. The canvas above you snaps once in the breeze. The ground under your blanket is uneven, and every pebble seems to have signed a private contract with your spine. You look up and the sky is huge already, with stars beginning to appear beyond the smoke. It is beautiful. Yes, that is the annoying part. Hardship so often arrives dressed as scenery. The smell of supper still hangs in the air, mixed with sweat and livestock, and the sweet char of wood smoke. Someone nearby laughs too loudly at a joke that was not really funny, and you recognize the sound for what it is. Relief. People laugh because morning will come, because the road is still ahead, not yet under their feet, because tonight they can still imagine themselves as the kind of family that reaches Oregon intact, stronger, nobler, maybe with better cheekbones in the retelling. There's one more quiet truth in this first camp. The trail has not started merely on the map, it has started inside you. Leaving home means entering a new relationship with uncertainty. You no longer belong to clocks, brick walls, and proper mattresses. You belong to weather animals, rivers, rumour, and chance. You belong increasingly to the open air. And that first realization arrives not at noon with cheering, but at night, when the fire burns low and the noises of camp stretch into the dark. So you pull the blanket a little higher. You listen to the oxen breathe. You feel the earth beneath you and the long road gathering itself just beyond the edge of the firelight. Independence is behind you already, even while you're still lying in it. By dawn, all these families will begin proving whether hope can survive dust distance, and the hard plain ground where sleep is about to become another daily chore. Morning comes without mercy. There is no gentle drifting awake out here, no soft curtain light, no kettle humming from a safe kitchen across the hall. You wake because the air bites your face, because somebody is already moving near the wagon wheels, because an ox snorts like an irritated landlord, and because the ground has spent all night reminding your bones that comfort is a privilege of settled people. The camp stirs in small sounds first, then larger ones. A pot lid rattles, leather creaks, someone calls for water, Someone else cannot find a spoon and seems to take this as a sign of national decline. You begin packing again, which is what trail life really is in the early going. Pack, walk, unpack, cook, sleep badly. Repeat until Oregon appears, or until your common sense finally files formal objections. Before many miles pass, you learn that space inside a wagon is the most argued over piece of real estate in your world. Every object must earn its place. Every comfort item must justify its own weight like a nervous witness on trial. This is one of the central facts of overland travel. Emigrant guidebooks and experienced trail voices often advised families to keep loads light, because overpacked wagons broke down tired animals faster and made rough ground even more punishing. Flour, bacon beans, coffee salt spare, clothing tools, ammunition, bedding, cooking gear, axle grease medicines if you had them, and barrels for water all competed for room. The trail rewards the practical, yet every family still sneaks in some little rebellion against pure practicality. A keepsake, a quilt too heavy to leave, a book, a teacup, a clock that will almost certainly become useless, but carries the gravity of home. You stand over the pile and realize this is not just packing, it is editing a life. A woman nearby wraps dishes in cloth with the care of a person who understands that breakage is not merely breakage. A cracked plate means one less useful object and one more small grief. A man lifts a crate, frowns, lifts it again and decides it weighs either too much or exactly what his pride insists it must weigh. Children hover with treasures in their hands, a wooden toy, a rag doll, a pet kitten that nobody agreed to transport but which somehow has already acquired trail status. Sentiment slips into wagons in very small forms. There is a famous practical wisdom that many emigrants learned quickly. Furniture was often discarded early in the journey. Heavy chests, stoves, chairs, and other ambitious domestic items look sensible in Missouri and ridiculous after a few weeks of mud rut and strain. Along the route, travellers really did leave possessions behind, creating a strange breadcrumb trail of abandoned plans. That is the mainstream historical core. People set out imagining they could carry a household west. The prairie had other ideas. A more unusual tidbit, and one that tells you much about human optimism, is that some travellers brought seeds for gardens they had not yet seen, fruit trees they dreamed of planting in Oregon soil, and even delicate household luxuries like china or framed pictures. You can almost admire it. There is something deeply moving about packing for a future orchard, while standing in a camp that smells of oxen and wet canvas. It is impractical, yes, but it is also a declaration. You're not just trying to survive. You're trying to arrive as a whole person. Historians continue to dispute how much of this overpacking came from ignorance and how much came from emotional necessity. Some scholars suggest that emigrants knew perfectly well they might abandon part of their load, but packed it anyway because leaving home required rituals of carrying. Others think many simply trusted bad advice from merchants eager to sell more goods. The truth may be both, which is often the least dramatic and most human answer. Commerce flatters anxiety. Anxiety buys extra kettles. You feel the hierarchy of needs settle in very fast. Bedding matters more than decorative objects. Food matters more than vanity. Tools matter more than almost everything, though not more than water. Spare wagon parts may save you in a way that family silver never will. And yet nobody is a machine. A mother may quietly refuse to leave behind a Bible with a worn family record page. A young woman may fold one better dress into a trunk because she cannot bear the thought that the trail gets to erase her entirely. A child may insist that a toy horse deserves passage west more than another pound of beans. Rationality has limits, especially before dawn. Clothing is another lesson in the gap between expectation and reality. You might imagine pioneer wardrobes as neat little collections of homespun virtue, all crisp bonnets and sturdy shirts. In practice, clothes must do everything. protect from sun wind, dust, cold brush, insects, and endless wear. They must dry when possible and survive when not. Women often wear layers that are both protective and cumbersome, and men do not exactly float through the heat in elegance either. Shoes are precious. Hats are essential. Spare socks are as close to luxury theology as this trail gets. Wet feet become an intimate enemy. The bedding is especially important because it governs the one thing everyone craves and almost nobody gets enough of: sleep. Blankets, quilts, maybe a feather bed if a family is unusually determined, and then increasingly regretful, all must be stored by day and spread by night. Remember that as you sort the wagon. What you pack now will shape what you lie on later beneath the open sky. Sleeping outside is not a romantic bonus feature of the Oregon Trail. It is the nightly condition of your existence. You hear quiet disagreements around camp the kind married people pretend are not arguments, because children are listening. Does the extra skillet stay or go? Do you need the second pair of boots? Should there be more dried apples and less coffee? This is social history at its finest, not in speeches, but in negotiations over who gets to define necessity. Men may publicly claim authority over equipment and route planning, but women often govern the intimate economy of actual survival because they know what it takes to feed bodies, comfort children, mend cloth, and keep some minimum order alive when everything is moving. A wagon party may look patriarchal in formal structure, yet practical authority leaks into the hands of whoever can make supper happen at sunset. The merchants at the jumping-off towns feed every uncertainty. They sell ready-made trail outfits, medicines of varying usefulness, and advice of very mixed quality. Some of that advice is sound. Take enough flour. Use oxen rather than horses if you can, because oxen endure hard conditions better and are less likely to be stolen. Start in spring to avoid winter in the mountains. Those are not bad notes. But then comes the clutter of miracle cures, suspicious tonics, and all the confident nonsense frontier commerce can produce when fear meets retail opportunity. Somewhere near you, a bottle of patent medicine glows, with promises it absolutely cannot keep. You look into the wagon again. It seems both full and insufficient. That is another truth of the trail. No family ever feels fully ready. You can count every sack twice, and still wonder if you forgot the one thing that matters: salt, needles, soap, extra rope, a small iron pot, a bit more coffee to make the mornings less tragic. There is no final certainty, only the moment when you must stop adjusting and begin moving. Children are folded into this packing calculus in ways both practical and heartbreaking. Very small ones cannot walk far, so space must exist for them at times in the wagon. Older children may walk most of the day and only tumble into bed at night, filthy and limp as dropped laundry. Their needs are constant, their resilience startling, their timing for hunger almost theatrical. A family heading west is not a neat unit of heroic stillness. It is a rolling weather system of demands, and still amid all this sorting the dream remains stubbornly bright. Oregon means land. It means possibility. For some it means escape from debt, crowded farms, illness, grief, or the narrowness of eastern life. For others it is simply the conviction that somewhere beyond all this uncertainty lies a place where hard work may finally pay more generously than it does at home. You pack that dream too, though it weighs more than the ironware. By the time the sun rises higher, you have made a dozen tiny decisions that feel absurdly final. This stays. That goes. This gets tied beneath the wagon. That is shoved beside the flour. A doll is rescued. A trunk is reduced. A skillet is declared non-negotiable. The oxen wait with ancient patience. Their patience is offensive. Then at last the wagon lurches forward and every item inside it shifts with a thud that sounds like fate settling into place. Behind you lie the stores, the bargaining the safety of more solid walls. Ahead lies the trail where each mile will test whether you packed wisely. slept enough and know the difference between what feels precious and what truly keeps you alive when night drops over the prairie and the bed waiting for you is the cold, uncomplaining earth. The first miles have a talent for pretending. That is the trouble with beginnings. They can be almost cheerful if the weather cooperates and nobody has yet lost a wheeler child or their temper in a way that becomes family legend for the next 40 years. The road west opens in a broad dusty line, and for a little while you can imagine that all the warning stories were simply the favourite hobby of nervous relatives. The grass moves in the breeze. The sky seems generous. Even the wagon creaks with a kind of determined optimism as if wood itself has decided to be brave. You walk beside it because of course you do. That little romantic picture of emigrants reclining inside the wagon, like passengers on a scenic railway trip, lasts only until your feet meet the actual trail. Most adults walk for much of the journey. That is a plain historical truth repeated in diaries again and again. Wagons carry goods children when needed, and those too ill or exhausted to keep up. If you are healthy, you walk. So the first illusion to fall away is the idea of ease. The wagon is not your carriage. It is your burden on wheels. At first the road is busy enough to feel social. Different wagon parties drift in and out of sight. Someone calls across the dust to ask about grazing. Someone else wants to know whether you heard that the river ahead runs high this season. A boy driving cattle tries to look older than he is and achieves only a sort of smoky dignity. Women shade their faces and keep moving. Men measure distance with a confidence that the afternoon will soon mock. There is conversation, a little laughter, and the subtle competition of people wanting to appear competent in front of strangers they may never see again and may absolutely need by nightfall. The land itself is doing something strange to your sense of scale. Back east distance often arrives in pieces. A hill, a fence, a town, a bend in the road. Here the country opens so wide that your eyes never quite settle. You start walking toward a point on the horizon, and an hour later it seems no closer, which feels like a personal insult from geography. The prairie has no respect for human impatience. It just keeps being large. Dust enters your life with immediate authority. It rises from wheels, hooves, and boots. It coats your hem, your hands, your food, your sleeping blanket, and your opinion of civilization. It gets between your teeth. It settles in your hair. It turns sweat into paste along the back of your neck. People on the Oregon Trail wrote often about dust, and once you feel it gathering on your skin, you understand why. Grand adventure sounds noble in a letter. Dust in your coffee sounds more accurate. There is also the pace, which is less dramatic than you imagined and somehow more tiring. Not a wild gallop into destiny, not a heroic charge westward with flag snapping and violin swelling. Just a long, deliberate, unglamorous movement. Oxen plod, wheels groan, people trudge. The trail is an argument for patience made entirely out of repetition. You learn quickly that speed is not the point. Endurance is. A fast wagon with broken animals gets nowhere. A steady wagon with stubborn oxen may eventually reach Oregon and judge you for complaining. A curious little tidbit begins circulating among the travellers by the third or fourth day. Some people believe that keeping a green branch tied to a wagon can help with dust or luck or general morale, depending on who is talking and how much sleep they got the night before. It is the sort of half-practical, half-superstitious custom that blooms beautifully in hard conditions. Human beings adore rituals when outcomes feel uncertain. A branch, a prayer, a lucky coin, a way of packing the coffee pot. We like to think that tiny acts can persuade enormous landscapes to be kind. Meanwhile, the actual physical work announces itself with clarity. Your shoulders ache from lifting and adjusting. Your calves complain with every slope. Your hands toughen around ropes, buckets, and wagon rails. The sun is not yet at its worst, but it already has opinions. If the morning begins cool, the afternoon often grows hot enough to make every layer of clothing feel like a personal betrayal. Sweat runs down your spine, your mouth dries out. Water becomes the centre of thought in a way that feels almost spiritual. Historians still debate how quickly emigrants shed their romantic expectations in these first days. Some journals suggest that spirits remained high for quite a while, especially before sickness or mechanical trouble set in. Other accounts imply the disillusionment was immediate, that the sheer labour of walking and managing animals stripped away fantasy almost at once. It probably depended on weather company and what kind of life you had known before. A person used to hard farm labour may have found the work familiar if not pleasant. A person from a more settled town life may have felt personally ambushed by the first week alone. The evenings arrive as both reward and warning. When the wagons halt, there is relief so intense it almost makes you laugh. Then comes the second surprise. Stopping does not mean resting. It means more work. Animals must be watered or grazed. Fires must be made. Supper must be cooked. Bedding must be unpacked. Children must be cleaned to whatever degree frontier standards still recognize the word cleaned. The first miles teach you that every day contains two labours, the moving and the stopping. Both are tiring in different ways. This is where the early illusion of camping charm starts to fray. Sleeping outside sounds picturesque when imagined from a chair indoors. On the trail, it's a practical arrangement with very limited romance after the first 10 minutes. The ground is uneven. The air cools fast after sunset. Your blanket smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and dust now, which is not awful, exactly, just honest. If there is dew, everything feels damp by morning. If there is wind, canvas snaps and loose things skitter. If there are insects, they act as if your entire party exists for their convenience. Still, the beauty is real, which is almost rude. The sky at night stretches so wide and clean that it can hush a whole camp for a moment. Fires burn low, oxen crop grass in the dark. Voices soften. Somewhere someone sings under their breath, perhaps because they are calm, perhaps because they are trying very hard to become calm. You lie down and feel the earth still warm in some places from the day. Then slowly it gives up that warmth and you pull the blanket closer. Social roles start sharpening too. Who rises first? Who complains most? Who can mend harness? Who can calm a frightened child? Who says they know the route, and who actually does? On the trail, personality stops being decorative and becomes practical. A patient woman who can organise supper from almost nothing may matter more to camp morale than the loudest self-appointed leader. A quiet teenager who handles stock well may save hours of panic. A chronic boaster becomes less amusing with every mile. There is one mainstream fact that settles over these days like dust itself. Early in the season, many wagon companies aim for a routine of starting early, halting by late afternoon, and using evening light for chores. It sounds sensible because it is. Yet sensible routine does not prevent weariness. By the time supper is done, your body hums with the dull fatigue of repeated motion, not heroic pain. Just enough to make lying down feel wonderful for perhaps 3 minutes before the ground begins negotiating with your ribs. You begin noticing how quickly little luxuries gain emotional weight. A cup of coffee before dawn, a patch of shade at midday, a dry place to sit while the fire is lit, clean socks, the chance to wash your face properly, a child falling asleep without tears. These are the early currencies of trail life. Nobody needs a lecture on gratitude. The road supplies one. And beneath all this comes the slow realization that the trip is not a grand, uninterrupted drama. It is built from ordinary discomforts repeated so steadily that they become transformative. Sore feet, dust, waiting, lifting, finding a place to sleep. Looking at the horizon and understanding that you have not conquered distance at all. You have merely entered into an agreement with it. So by the end of these first miles, the illusions are not gone entirely, but they are thinner now, worn at the edges. The West remains possible, even desirable. Oregon still glows somewhere ahead in the imagination, but the road to it has begun introducing itself properly, not as a noble line on a map, but as a daily life of effort, dust, and nights under the open sky, where each hard-earned hour teaches you that this journey will not flatter you. It will simply keep moving and ask whether you can do the same tomorrow. By now, night has stopped pretending to be charming. The first time you bed down beside the wagon ruts, you may still carry a little of that civilized illusion that sleep is a thing you simply decide to have. You spread the blankets, shake out the dust as best you can, glance up at a sky full of stars and think perhaps this will be tolerable, maybe even memorable in a grand, wholesome sort of way. Then you lie down and the earth introduces itself point by point through your shoulder, your hip, your lower back, and every other place that had once taken mattresses for granted. Sleeping outside on the Oregon Trail is not one single experience. It is an endless negotiation between your body, the weather, the ground, the noises around you, the condition of your bedding, and whatever anxious thought decides to visit at 2 a.m. Some families sleep under the wagon for shelter from dew or light rain. Some make bedrolls on the open ground. Some rig bits of canvas, or use the wagon cover as a barrier against wind. Children may be tucked into the wagon itself if there is room. Adults usually get the earth which remains unfailingly available and completely uninterested in your preferences. One reliable fact from emigrant accounts is that nights on the trail were commonly spent in these improvised arrangements, not in the neat little cabins and tidy camps later art would encourage you to picture. The trail is a moving settlement without walls. Privacy is thin, comfort is thinner. Even the act of undressing for sleep becomes a limited affair. You loosen what you can remove boots if you dare, and try not to think too hard about what might crawl, creep, or suddenly soak everything before morning. The ground has personalities. Prairie grassland can seem soft until you discover the hidden roots, humps, and stones. Riverbank camps may be cooler, prettier, and full of insects who regard you as a late supper option. Muddy ground steals heat from you with a sort of damp malice. Dry ground leaves grit in every fold of bedding. Sometimes you find a decent patch and feel a ridiculous surge of triumph, as if you have purchased prime real estate in the kingdom of exhaustion. What surprises you most is how public sleep becomes. Back home rest has doors around it. Here you lie within earshot of everyone. You hear murmured conversations from married couples who think whispering makes them invisible. You hear a mother soothing a child with that low tone reserved for fear and fever. You hear someone clearing his throat again and again in the dark. You hear the animals shifting, breathing, stamping, jangling harness chain. Night is never truly silent. It only changes the kind of labour going on. There is an odd little tale that floats through more than one emigrant circle, the sort of thing people repeat while drawing blankets tight. Some travellers insist that sleeping with your boots partly under your head keeps spiders or snakes from investigating them. Whether this helped much is another matter entirely, but the custom says something wonderfully human. On the trail you build tiny systems against chaos. Boots under the head, fire bank just so, rope tied twice, flower covered again. It is not merely habit. It is a way of telling yourself the night can be managed. Researchers do not all agree on how much sleep emigrants actually got on an average night. Some diary evidence suggests people were often so tired that they dropped off quickly despite discomfort. Other accounts make it clear that noise, cold, worry, and interrupted chores left many running on far less rest than their bodies needed. The difference probably depended on age, whether illness, the size of the party, and whether the oxen chose to behave like saints or unionized rebels after dark. And then there is the sky. This is the cruel advantage of sleeping outdoors on the plains. The sky can be magnificent enough to make you briefly forgive everything below it. Once the fires settle and the smoke thins, stars spread over you in impossible numbers. The Milky Way is not a poetic phrase now. It is a pale river overhead. You can understand why so many travellers wrote about the heavens with such reverence. There are nights when the stars feel close enough to rest on the wagon hoops, and for a moment the fatigue, the dirt, the sore ankles, the low-grade panic about river crossings to come, all of it softens. Then something pokes you in the ribs and the spell ends. Temperature is another nightly villain. Summer days may be hot, but after sunset the air can cool quickly on the open plains. The heat drains from the ground, dampness settles in. Blankets that seemed heavy in the wagon feel insultingly thin by midnight. People huddle closer to children. Extra coats become bedding. A shawl turns into treasure. You learn very quickly that warmth is not only about luxury. It is about whether tomorrow begins with a body that can keep moving. Women often carry an especially heavy burden in these camp arrangements, because the work of creating a place fit for sleep usually lands partly in their hands. Bedding must be unpacked. Children must be arranged, garments aired if possible. Wet items kept away from drier ones, and all this after supper and clean-up. Social life on the trail does not pause at sunset. Domestic labour simply changes shape in the dark. Men may still be checking stock or speaking with others about the next day's route, but many women are the ones turning a patch of open land into something that can with enough imagination be called a sleeping place. Children react to outdoor nights in ways that range from delighted to absolutely betrayed. A very small child may think the stars are marvellous and the ground offensive. Older children may fall asleep so fast they seem dropped by invisible hands. Teenagers try to act unbothered, though even they pull blankets tight when the coyotes begin sounding off somewhere beyond the firelight. There is tenderness in it, even in the discomfort. Families become small islands of familiar touch in a landscape too large to hold. The odours of camp settle around you. Smoke in cloth, livestock nearby, bacon grease lingering from supper, damp wool, dust in everything. Human bodies that have worked all day and done only the most strategic washing. Nobody smells elegant. By this point, elegance has packed up and gone home. Yet the scents are strangely grounding too. They tell you the camp is alive, that everyone else is enduring the same night in some variation of equal indignity. Contemporary letters and journals also hint at a practical truth often polished away in later retellings. People feared theft, wandering animals, sudden storms, sickness in the dark, and missing children. Those fears sat right beside ordinary tiredness. Rest was never only physical. It depended on the camp feeling reasonably secure, and secure was always a flexible frontier word. A wagon circle might comfort one party and mean little to another. A good fire might calm you until the wind shifted. A calm evening might unravel with one missing ox. You discover something else while lying there awake between one sound and another. Outdoor sleeping changes your sense of time. Indoors nights are enclosed. On the trail they are open-ended. There is no ceiling to contain them. The dark stretches in all directions, and you feel both tiny and acutely present inside it. You listen for dawn almost as much as you listen to the animals. The night becomes not an absence of day, but its own long terrain, something you must cross. And yet people do cross it, night after night. That may be the most striking truth of all. Human beings adapt with alarming speed to things they never would have chosen. A week ago, the idea of making a bed beside wagon ruts might have sounded desperate. Now it is simply the evening task. A poor patch of ground becomes acceptable. A half-dry blanket becomes good enough. A few hours of broken sleep becomes normal. You do not become comfortable exactly. You become skilled at discomfort. So you lie there staring up through the wagon tongues at the wheeling stars, feeling every ridge in the earth beneath the blanket and every inch of distance still ahead. Around you the camp breathes and mutters in its sleep. A horse shakes its mane. Someone turns over with a sigh. The fire drops into a red glow. You pull your coat a little closer around your chest and wait for rest to take pity on you, knowing that when morning comes, the whole weary procession will rise, pack itself back into motion, and carry this hard-won fatigue forward into another day. By evening, hunger begins speaking with a voice all its own. You have walked through the long daylight with dust on your lips and the rhythm of wheels in your ears, and now the camp slows into that tender, weary hour when everyone wants the same few things at once. Water, food, a place to sit that is not actively trying to bruise the soul. The wagons creak into stillness the animals are seen to, and then the whole company turns towards supper with the focused seriousness of people who know that a warm meal can hold a family together better than a sermon. The first thing you notice is how quickly the fire becomes the centre of the world. Not just for heat, though, that matters when the air cools. Not just for cooking, though everyone is thinking about that. The fire gathers people into a rough circle of light, where faces become visible again after a day spent squinting into brightness and dust. It is the closest thing camp has to a parlour, a kitchen, a meeting room and a chapel all at once. Flames lick upward, wood snaps, kettles shift, and suddenly the immense prairie feels a little less likely to swallow you whole. One well-established truth from trail records is that meals on the Oregon Trail were often plain repetitive, and shaped by what could be carried without spoiling. Flour, bacon, beans, rice, coffee, dried fruit if you were lucky, and salt were common staples. Fresh food grew scarce unless game was found, milk was available from cows brought along, or some trade could be made. There was no nightly feast waiting in the wagon, no secret reserve of comfort cuisine. Supper was usually an exercise in making endurance taste almost respectable, and yet the smells can be deeply reassuring. Bacon frying in a pan, coffee rising dark and bitter from a pot blackened by many fires, biscuits or flapjacks if flour can be spared, and someone has the time and patience to coax them into being. Beans warming slowly, a bit of onion if fortune has smiled on your supplies. The odours fold into the smoke and drift across camp, and tired children begin circling like small, hopeful planets. Even thin food can seem luxurious when the body has spent the whole day being jostled by distance. There is a curious little detail preserved in some emigrant recollections that says more about morale than nutrition. A few families carried small stores of treats, such as sugar candy preserves or precious spices, not because these were necessary, but because a spoonful of sweetness after a dreadful day could feel almost medicinal. It is easy to smile at this, but only until you've spent 12 hours walking in grit and then discover what one bit of jam on a biscuit can do for the human spirit. Civilization survives in strange pockets. Opinions differ among historians about how skillfully emigrants cooked under these conditions. Some descriptions make camp food sound efficient and hearty, while others reveal just how chaotic outdoor cooking could become after a brutal day, especially in bad weather or when fuel was short. The answer likely varies from camp to camp. A practiced farm woman with a steady hand and decent supplies could produce something admirable from almost nothing. A less prepared party, tired and damp, might create a meal best described as educational, and while the food itself matters, the routine matters just as much. Supper is one of the few points in the day when movement gives way to ritual. The pots come out, the fire is built, water is fetched if any is near. Dough is mixed, bacon-sliced cups located, children reminded not to step into everything. And somehow out of this bustle comes order. It is domestic life stripped to its frame. No wallpaper, no cupboards, no polished table, but all the familiar motions remain. Stir, pour, pass, wait, eat. Women often carry the heaviest share of this evening labour, though not always alone. On the trail, cooking after sundown is not a quaint frontier tableau. It is one more demanding task performed by bodies already exhausted. A woman may have walked all day, tended children, mended clothes on the move, and then still find herself kneeling by the fire trying to coax supper from bacon grease and determination. Men help in some parties, especially with stock fuel water and rough camp setup, but the burden of making rough life feel livable falls again and again into female hands. That is one of the quiet realities social history keeps rescuing from heroic myth. Children respond to supper with pure honesty. They are starving or they insist they are dying, which on the trail can sound alarmingly similar. They fuss, reach, spill, laugh, doze, and revive the instant food appears. A mother tears bread into smaller portions. Someone calls coffee for an older child with a long, careful blow. A toddler falls asleep before taking the second bite. A teenager eats like a farm animal at harvest, and then stares into the fire as if adulthood has arrived early and uninvited. Then there is the silence that comes once the first urgent hunger is satisfied. It's not absolute silence, never that. There is still chewing, the clink of tin, an animal shifting nearby, an infant fussing, a kettle being scraped. But conversation thins for a few moments because everyone is receiving the same simple mercy. Calories, warmth, pause. You can feel the camp soften around the edges. Some people pray before or after the meal, and the act can be formal or barely whispered. Trail diaries make clear that religion travelled west quite sturdily. Whether in full family worship, brief blessings over food, hymn singing, or private muttered appeals directed heavenward after a truly miserable day. Not everyone is equally devout, of course. Some are too tired for theology beyond "please let tomorrow be less ridiculous." But even that is a form of prayer if you squint. Conversation returns gradually. Someone mentions the road ahead. Someone asks whether the ford tomorrow will be difficult. Someone jokes that the oxen are eating better than the humans. Somebody else laughs harder than the line deserves because fatigue lowers the bar for comedy to a heroic degree. Stories are told. Small complaints are aired. Advice circulates with suspicious confidence. The firelight changes faces, making the worried look thoughtful, and the thoughtful look haunted. There is a gentle but important fact hidden in these evening gatherings. Camps were not only logistical units, they were emotional communities, however temporary. Families depended on one another and often on neighbouring wagons for reassurance, news help, and the simple comfort of hearing another adult voice before sleep. Isolation existed, yes, but so did fellowship. A shared pot, a loaned cup, a borrowed ember, a few minutes of talk while the children drift off, these things mattered more than trail legends usually admit. The prairie beyond the fire remains vast and unreadable. Once the light drops fully, you can sense how little separates your small circle from the larger dark. That is when the campfire becomes more than practical. It is a boundary. Inside it names routines, and remembered manners still exist. Outside it wind and distance take over. You can understand why people linger near the flames even after eating is done. Nobody is eager to hand themselves over to the cold ground and the long black hours just yet. And yet that moment comes. Pots are cleaned as best they can be. Grease is dealt with. Leftovers, if there are any, are put away from animals and careless feet. Children are bundled toward bedrolls. Someone stretches a stiff back and looks as though age has arrived in one day. Coffee cups empty. Sparks rise and vanish into the dark. The conversation grows quieter, more intimate, then thinner still. In the fading light, the camp seems to breathe out. You sit with the last warmth of the fire against your hands and feel how much supper is done, even though it was plain, and probably over-salted or undercooked or both. It has fed the body, yes, but it has also restored sequence to the day. Stop, gather, cook, share, chew, rest. Without these evening motions, the trail would become only motion and strain. With them, even this rough life gains shape. So the silence that follows is not empty. It is full of embers, smoke, full stomachs, tired children, unspoken worries, and the strange peace that comes when a group of worn-out people have made it through one more day and turned hunger, if only briefly, into something warm and manageable before the prairie night closes around them again. Darkness on the prairie does not arrive quietly, it gathers. At first the camp simply dims. The firelight grows richer, the edges of faces soften, and the sky lifts itself into that deep blue hour when everything seems briefly suspended between labour and sleep. Then the last practical tasks are done, the cups are set aside, the children are tucked down, and you begin to notice that the night has its own machinery. It is never empty. It is never still. It only sounds different from the day, which is somehow more unsettling. Daytime noise belongs to purpose. Night noise belongs to imagination. You lie down beside the wagon and tell yourself to rest. The blanket is arranged as well as it can be. Your shoes are where you can find them in the dark. Someone nearby gives the fire a final nudge. The stars are up in ridiculous numbers. The ground remains firm in its opinion that no one should be comfortable. You close your eyes anyway. Then the first coyote calls. It begins far off, almost thin enough to mistake for wind, and then other voices answer from different directions, turning the open country into a web of sound. To modern ears, coyotes can seem almost theatrical, all eerie chorus and lonely mockery. On the trail, hearing them at night is less poetic. It reminds you how little of this land belongs to your routines. The camp may have its pots, prayers, and family order, but beyond the faint ring of human light, the prairie continues under older rules. Many emigrant journals mention animal sounds after dark, especially coyotes and wolves, though actual attacks on people were uncommon compared with the fears people carried. That is one of those useful historical realities. The sound mattered more than the danger in most cases. Still, when you're half asleep on open ground with children nearby and livestock to guard the distinction, is not especially soothing. Fear does not always require statistics. It merely requires darkness and a noise you cannot fully place. And the coyotes are only the beginning. Oxen shift, snort stamp and rattle their yokes. Chains jingle, harness leather creaks, cattle low in long unhappy tones that seem to come from the centre of the earth. Horses tug at picket ropes and shake their heads. A mule, should one be present, contributes a note of personal grievance to the entire soundscape. It is astonishing how much noise large animals can make while supposedly settling down. Their rest is a public event. Then there are the human sounds. A baby cries in that raw, urgent way that slices straight through any pretense of calm. Somewhere a mother murmurs the same soft line again and again until the child yields to sleep. A man coughs so hard that 3 other people wake and silently judge his lungs. Someone turns over on a bedroll and releases the weary sigh of a person whose joints have entered open rebellion. A whispered conversation rises, fades, rises again. Laughter slips out suddenly from one corner of camp, quickly hushed, then followed by the little silence of people listening to hear whether anyone minded. This is one of the most revealing things about trail life at night. Privacy becomes mostly acoustic rather than physical. You cannot help hearing one another. Marriage quarrels, bedtime stories, anxious planning, homesick tears, all of it travels a bit through canvas and dark air. People who may have enjoyed sturdy walls back east are now living in a world where family life leaks into the open. That changes relationships. It also deepens them in odd ways. You become aware of other people not as polished public selves, but as tired breathing creatures trying to make it to dawn. A wonderfully odd detail survives in some trail recollections. A few travellers claim they could tell which family was settling down by the pattern of noises each camp corner made. One child always whimpered before sleep. One father always shook out the blankets too hard. One woman sang half a hymn while folding clothes. Whether that memory has been polished by time is hard to know, but it feels true in spirit. Repetition creates identity. Even in a temporary camp, people develop recognizable night signatures. There is still uncertainty among specialists about how far nightly fears were shaped by actual threat, and how far by rumour. Some parties were extremely anxious about attack theft or predators. Others seem to have regarded the ordinary night sounds with more irritation than terror. Much depended on where you were, whom you were travelling with, what stories had passed down the wagon line that day, and how exhausted you felt. Fatigue can turn a harmless noise into a prophecy in one heartbeat. The wind has its own part to play. When it moves through grass or around wagon covers, it produces a low, restless whisper that seems almost conversational. Canvas snaps. Loose ropes tap wood. A poorly tied object knocks softly again and again, until somebody groans, gets up and fixes it with a kind of anger. Only the sleep-deprived truly understand. The prairie at night is an orchestra conducted by inconvenience. And then, of course, there are the insects. Crickets scrape away as if filing paperwork. Mosquitoes test your resolve near the ear. Other small unseen creatures make dry, tiny motions in grass or brush that your mind instantly upgrades into something huge and purposeful. You know rationally that most of these noises mean nothing. Rational thought, however, is not at its sharpest when you're lying outdoors at midnight wrapped in a blanket that smells of smoke and ox. Children often fear the night more than the day, though they also adapt with startling speed. One evening they are certain the coyotes mean the end of civilization. 3 nights later they are asleep before the second howl. Adults are less flexible in some ways. A grown person can spend hours pretending not to be bothered by a noise that a child would have named and cried over honestly. The trail teaches everyone to economize their reactions. If you panicked each time something sounded strange, you would never sleep at all. Still, no one sleeps deeply every night. That is the plain truth beneath all the scenery. Broken rest becomes normal. People doze, wake, listen, adjust the blanket, drift off again, and rise at dawn only partly restored. Some nights are better. A calm evening after a decent meal may offer several honest hours of oblivion. Other nights fragment into intervals so short you feel as though morning arrived by accident. Yet the body keeps going, which is both impressive and slightly concerning. There is another layer to the soundscape too. Rumour rides into night. If word has spread that another party lost livestock, if someone thinks strangers were seen nearby, if tensions rose during the day, then every ordinary noise acquires a dramatic costume. A shifting ox becomes a prowler. Distant voices become plotting. The crack of wood in the fire sounds suspiciously like something else entirely. Human beings are story-making creatures, especially when tired. And all of this unfolds beneath that same vast, beautiful sky, which remains indifferent to your interrupted rest. The stars continue overhead. The moon, if present, throws pale shapes across wagon wheels and bedrolls. Faces look different in that light, calmer perhaps, or more fragile. The camp seems to float in darkness rather than sit upon the land. It can feel lonely and crowded at the same time, which is a very particular frontier sensation. So you lie there listening to the concert of the trail, coyotes calling across distance, oxen breathing, chains ticking, a child settling at last, wind moving through canvas, someone near the wagon clearing a throat and then going quiet. It is not the peaceful silence you might have dreamed of when thinking about wilderness. It is a living, unsettled chorus that follows you night after night, and in time, almost without noticing, you begin to learn its patterns. Not enough to master them, just enough that the noises of the dark become less like warnings, and more like the rough, uneven lullaby of a world in which sleep is never perfect, only borrowed until dawn. Rain changes everything faster than almost any other force on the trail. A dry camp, however uncomfortable, still allows for certain comforting illusions. You can spread bedding and tell yourself it will do. You can light a fire without pleading with the universe. You can keep flour, mostly dry children, mostly patient, and your own temper, mostly within the boundaries of Christian respectability. Then the sky darkens in late afternoon, the wind shifts, and everybody in camp begins looking upward, with the same expression people wear when they realize nature has scheduled a lesson. At first it may be only a scent, that cool mineral smell rolling over warm dust. Then comes the hush in the grass, the sudden agitation among animals, the quickened pace of hands packing loose items away. Someone calls for the blankets. Someone else begins dragging supplies closer beneath the wagon cover. A child asks whether the storm will be bad, which is a charming question, because the answer is always yes if you are sleeping outside. The first drops strike canvas in slow, heavy taps. Then they multiply. Then the prairie disappears behind a curtain of water. The trail in rain is not merely wet. It becomes rearranged. Ground that seemed tolerable turns slick and clinging. Wagon wheels cut deeper. Boots gather mud until every foot feels fitted with 2 new bricks. Clothing takes on weight and chill. Ropes swell. Wood darkens. Camp transforms from a rough domestic space into a rescue operation for flour sacks, kindling and morale. Contemporary emigrant journals make it very clear that storms could turn travel miserable in astonishingly little time. Rain-soaked bedding delayed movement, fouled roads, and made fire-building difficult. That basic fact appears again and again because it touched every level of daily life. It is hard to romanticize the frontier while trying to keep a blanket dry with one hand and a skillet from floating away with the other. Mud is a democratic force. It ruins everyone's evening equally. The worst part may be the blankets. Dry bedding is one of the few great luxuries available on the trail, and once quilts or bedrolls are damp, the whole night changes character. You do not simply lie down and rest. You settle into a chilly, reluctant embrace with fabric that seems to have absorbed both weather and disappointment. Dampness gets into collars, cuffs, hair and bone. The cold is not always fierce, but it is persistent, and persistence is the true genius of discomfort. An odd little piece of camp wisdom circulates whenever storms threaten. Some travellers swore that keeping bedding wrapped in oilcloth or tucked in a very particular order beneath the wagon could save at least part of it from soaking. Others trusted layers of old canvas buffalo robes or even improvised barriers made from spare clothing. None of these methods was perfect, but the ingenuity matters. Human beings become amateur engineers the moment dry sleep is at risk. Experts looking back do not entirely agree on how well emigrant parties prepared for repeated wet weather. Some families were experienced enough with farm life wagons and exposure that they clearly knew rain would be one of the journey's central nuisances. Others seem to have underestimated just how difficult it would be to dry belongings once they were thoroughly soaked, especially on stretches where the sky stayed grey for days. The evidence suggests both competence and wishful thinking, sometimes in the very same wagon. When the road itself turns to mud, the day's labour follows you straight into the night. Animals arrive, tired and irritable. Wheels need checking. Clothing has to be wrung out or hung where it can catch whatever breeze remains. Fires become precious and stubborn. You learn very quickly that a fire in wet weather is not a simple thing you light. It is a victory, and like all frontier victories, it depends on preparation and luck, and at least one person in camp who knows how to protect dry tinder like sacred relics. Without decent fire, supper suffers. Bacon may remain half-cooked. Coffee becomes more aspiration than beverage. Dough turns gummy. Smoke blows in everyone's faces. Children cry harder when cold and wet. Adults become curt in that dangerous restrained way that says nobody has energy left for open argument. Rain strips the polish from manners. It also reveals who is useful under pressure. One person shields the flame, another moves the youngest children, someone else secures the food boxes. A woman whose hands have already done 10 impossible things that day somehow keeps stirring the pot. That is one of the quieter truths of bad weather on the Oregon Trail. A storm does not pause domestic work, it multiplies it. Meals still need preparing, little ones still need changing, and comforting wet clothes still need sorting, and somewhere in the middle of it all, somebody has to decide whether family can actually lie down. Outdoor life does not become less domestic in hardship. It becomes more intensely so. Every small act of order is also an act of resistance. And then there is the sound of rain at night. On canvas it drums, on wagon wood it knocks, in grass it whispers, under the wheels it becomes sucking mud. If the storm is hard enough, it drowns conversation and turns camp into a world of gestures and hunched shoulders. If thunder joins in, the entire sky seems to be dragging furniture overhead. Lightning flashes white across wagon hoops and frightened faces, making everything look briefly theatrical and entirely unsafe. The animals feel it too. Oxen shift, horses toss their heads, cattle mutter in low, agitated tones. Nobody truly relaxes. One practical reality often noted in overland accounts is that people sometimes sought shelter under or beside the wagon in storms, though this was limited comfort at best. Wagons could block some rain and wind, especially for children or stored goods, but they were not magic travelling cottages. Water found ways in. Mud spread everywhere. Knees and backs complained bitterly. Yet even a little shelter felt worth contorting for. Human dignity is surprisingly flexible when the alternative is lying in a puddle. There is a special kind of despair that arrives when you realise the rain has seeped into tomorrow as well as tonight. Wet boots mean morning misery. Damp flour means bad meals. Muddy wheels mean slower progress. A soaked bedroll means the next evening begins behind schedule because drying it becomes part of the day's work. Rain is not content with ruining 1 hour. It likes to build a system. Still, people found ways to cope. Songs were sung in some camps, usually with a bit too much forced cheer. Jokes emerged because nothing invites grim humour like the sight of 6 respectable adults trying to rescue a cooking fire from a storm with bits of tin and deeply offended expressions. Children, once they stopped crying, sometimes became fascinated by the sheer spectacle of it all. And when the rain eased, even briefly, the whole camp turned outward again, hanging, spreading, ringing, scraping, salvaging. There is something revealing in the morning after a wet night. Steam rises from blankets draped over wagon tongues. Shirts hang limp in pale sunlight. Mud clings thick to wheels and hems. Faces look older before breakfast. Yet people keep moving. They do not wait to feel restored. The trail rarely offers that luxury. You pack damp things because you must. You walk in half-dried clothes because the road does not care. You tell yourself the sun may come out later, and sometimes it even does. By this point, you begin to understand that weather on the trail is not background scenery. It is one of the main characters, and a moody one. Rain decides how well you eat, how much you sleep, how hard tomorrow feels, and whether anyone in camp has patience left for small foolishness. It enters your blankets, your boots, your supper, your bones. It teaches the same lesson again and again. Outdoor living means bargaining with the sky, and the sky never signs anything. So when night closes over a sodden camp and you crawl beneath a blanket that is no longer entirely trustworthy, you listen to the last drops ticking from the wagon cover and feel the cold, damp earth underneath. Nearby someone coughs. A child whimpers once and goes quiet. The fire gives off more smoke than heat. Everything smells of wet canvas, mud and livestock. And there in the dark, wrapped in fabric that has failed you only slightly less than the weather itself, you learn just how long a night can be when the whole world has turned to water and morning is still somewhere beyond the rain. By the time the light starts thinning at the edge of day, you might imagine the work is nearly over. The wagons have stopped. The animals are being seen to. The road for a few precious hours cannot demand another mile from your feet. Surely evening means relief. It does not really. It simply means the labour changes hands, changes shape and becomes quieter. As the sun lowers, camp turns into a workshop of small necessary motions, and much of that work falls to women. You see it everywhere once you know to look. A pot is set out and scrubbed with sand or rinsed with precious water. A child's torn hem is examined in the last useful light. Wet stockings are spread where they might dry. A baby is soothed on one hip while the other hand reaches for meal salt or thread. Supper is not merely cooked. It is planned, coaxed, improvised, stretched. Bedding is not merely unrolled. It is shaken, checked, arranged, protected from damp, and made into something a tired family can collapse into without completely losing heart. This is one of the clearer truths preserved in diaries and letters from the overland trails. Women's labour did not end when the wagons halted. In many ways it intensified. After a day of walking, tending children, and helping manage the motion of the company, many women still handled cooking, cleaning, mending, washing, and emotional steadiness after dark. The trail depended on that work even when later heroic stories preferred to place all romance in the hands of men with whips, rifles, and root opinions. And there is something especially unforgiving about evening chores, because they arrive when the body is least ready for them. Your shoulders already ache. Your feet feel as though they belong to somebody older and less optimistic. Dust has pasted itself along your cuffs and collar, yet now the meal must be made because hunger has not been moved by your exhaustion. The children must be settled because they are 1 hour from turning into tiny public revolutionaries. Torn clothing must be repaired if possible because a small rip on the trail has ambitions. It plans to become a large one at the worst moment imaginable. You kneel by the fire and feel the heat on your face while your back remains cool in the evening air. Smoke curls into your eyes because smoke has an almost moral commitment to choosing the most inconvenient direction. The kettle needs minding. Something needs stirring. Someone needs wiping off. There is always one more thing that did not exist in your mind 5 minutes ago and is now somehow urgent. This is domestic life stripped down to bone and nerve. A lesser known but revealing detail from some emigrant recollections is that women occasionally traded recipes, remedies, and household shortcuts right there on the trail in the middle of all that uncertainty. Imagine it. You are 2,000 inconveniences from a proper kitchen, and still someone is explaining a better way to thicken gravy or soothe a child's cough. It sounds almost absurd until you understand that sharing household knowledge is a survival tool. Practical wisdom travels as surely as flour and axle grease. There is no universal agreement among historians about whether the Oregon Trail fundamentally loosened gender roles or hardened them. Some evidence suggests necessity forced more flexible cooperation, with men cooking, women handling animals, children taking on adult tasks, and everyone adapting when illness or weather demanded it. Other records show the familiar pattern remained quite strong, with women expected to keep domestic order under almost impossible conditions, while men oversaw livestock route decisions and wagon mechanics. The answer, irritatingly enough for anyone craving a neat sentence, appears to be both. Hardship can rearrange duties without fully rearranging expectations. What you notice in camp is not ideology, it is tempo. Men may still be out with the stock or speaking in low voices about tomorrow's route, but near the fires and bedrolls there is another world operating at once. A girl no older than 12 rocks an infant with a look of practiced patience that feels far too old for her face. A mother patches a shirt sleeve in fading light, biting off thread with her front teeth. An older woman checks the coffee pot, then checks a feverish child, then checks whether the blankets are far enough from sparks. Every motion is economical. Nobody wastes steps because nobody has steps left to waste. Even the act of washing becomes a small epic. Water is precious and often inconveniently located. Soap, if available, must justify its use. Clothes cannot be cleaned carelessly when drying space is limited, and tomorrow promises more dust anyway. Yet people try because grime is not just ugly. It chafes. It smells. It invites misery in ways that become obvious only when you're wearing the same layers day after day. A wiped face, clean hands before eating a rinsed garment. These are not vanities. They are fragments of order. The children complicate everything and make it meaningful all at once. One needs feeding slowly because she's fallen half asleep sitting up. Another has discovered a thorn in his stocking, only now naturally at the exact moment the pot is threatening to boil over. A third wants a story while the bread is still being turned. Evening is when their tiredness spills into tears, laughter, clinging affection, an occasional dramatic injustice over who got the larger biscuit. Women absorb much of this weather. That may be one of the least celebrated skills on the trail, the ability to keep everyone else from unravelling, while you are privately one inconvenience away from doing it yourself. A particularly telling fact about overland family life is that many women kept diaries or wrote letters when they could, even after days packed with physical work. That means the historical record of the trail often survives, because exhausted women still found time by firelight or fading dust to note births, deaths, weather chores, fear, boredom, hunger, and the look of the plains. It is a remarkable act when you think about it. After every practical duty they added witness, and evening is also the hour of invisible labour the sort no inventory can list properly. You are not only feeding people, you are reassuring them. You are deciding whether to sound calm when the river crossing ahead has everyone worried. You're not only mending a tear, you're preserving decency routine, the feeling that tomorrow can still begin in some recognisable human shape. You're not only laying out blankets, you're making a little island of a home on raw earth. That emotional work matters enormously. A weary husband may come to the fire wanting food and a tone of confidence he does not have to manufacture himself. Children want certainty even when none exists. Other women in camp may exchange a look that says more than a speech could. Sometimes that look means help me. Sometimes it means I see you. Sometimes it means if one more person asks whether supper is ready, I may walk directly to Oregon alone. There are moments, though, when the burden lifts slightly. A shirt gets repaired. The children finally settle. The bread turns out edible, which in these circumstances counts as a triumph of civilization. Someone nearby starts humming. Another woman laughs softly but genuinely at a joke too dry and tired to survive in daylight. You feel then how communities of women form even in passing camps, built from borrowed needles, shared complaints, and the mutual recognition that almost nobody else quite understands how the trail follows you into the night. As darkness deepens, these chores taper rather than end. The last cup is rinsed, the last child is arranged beneath a quilt, the last ember is nudged into usefulness. Your hands smell of smoke, dough, wool, and whatever herb or grease passed through them in the past hour. Your back protests when you straighten. Your mind is still ticking through tomorrow before you lie down. Is there enough flour? Will the little one's cough ease? Did that seam hold? Are the blankets far enough from dew? This is what evening means out here. Not stillness at least, not at first. Not rest delivered kindly. It means another shift of labour quieter than the day's marching, but no less necessary. And as you lower yourself at last onto the waiting ground with supper done and children breathing more evenly in the dark, you realise how much of the trail's survival depends on work that leaves almost no monument behind. No statue for the woman who got the socks dry enough. No ballad for the girl who kept the baby asleep. No grand speech for the hands that made a patch of prairie feel for one fading hour almost like a household. Children changed the sound of the trail after dark. Without them, camp would still be noisy, still restless, still full of the practical music of animals, cookware, low voices, and the endless little frictions of sleeping outside. But children add another layer entirely. They bring laughter that arrives out of nowhere, tears that seem to begin in the soles of the feet, games invented from sticks and shadows, and questions so direct they cut through every adult attempt at looking composed. On the Oregon Trail, children are not merely passengers in the family story. Their daily weather, sometimes fair, sometimes dramatic, always impossible to ignore. All through the late afternoon after the wagon stop and before supper settles them, they move through camp with the strange energy of the very tired. One minute they're dragging their feet as though sorrow itself has attached weights to their ankles. The next they're running in uneven circles around a wagon wheel, announcing some urgent frontier business involving pebbles, a broken hoop, and rules nobody over the age of 10 can properly understand. A little girl cradles a rag doll blackened slightly by dust. A boy pretends a stick is a rifle, a fishing pole and a sword within the span of 4 minutes. 2 children squat by the edge of camp and solemnly inspect an insect as though it were a diplomatic envoy from another nation. There is good historical evidence that children on the overland trails were expected to work as well as play. Older children helped herd livestock, gather fuel, fetch water, watch younger siblings, and carry out small but necessary chores around camp. This is one of those plain realities that immediately strips away any polished picture of frontier childhood. These were not endless summer holidays in bonnets. Children were part of the labour system. Still, they remain children, and that means games kept appearing in the cracks of hardship stubborn as grass. A delightful little detail turns up in some family reminiscences. Children sometimes collected curious trail souvenirs such as bright stones, feathers, bits of discarded iron or animal bones, filling their pockets with treasures that adults mostly regarded as extra weight and possible trouble. It feels exactly right. Put a child in one of the harshest travel environments imaginable, and that child will still find a shiny pebble, worth carrying to the end of the earth. Human wonder is remarkably uncooperative, when night begins to gather though wonder changes flavour. Daytime curiosity can turn into nighttime dread with astonishing speed. A tree stump seen at noon is merely a stump. The same stump after sundown becomes a suspicious figure with unclear intentions. The coyotes call, and suddenly every child in camp remembers every whispered warning, every half-overheard story, every glance adults thought went unnoticed. You can almost see imagination flick on behind their eyes like lantern light. Commentators who study overland family life do not all land in the same place on how frightened children generally were during the journey. Some diary evidence suggests that many adapted quickly and treated trail life with surprising matter-of-factness, especially if the adults around them projected steadiness. Other accounts reveal recurring fear of storms, darkness, strange noises, and the possibility of getting lost or left behind. Most likely it shifted from child to child, from age to age, and from one camp to the next. Some children are born practical, others are connoisseurs of terror. Many manage both before bedtime. You see the difference most clearly in how they settle at night. The smallest children often want touch plain and immediate. A hand on the shoulder, a body beside them, a known voice saying ordinary things in a calm way. Older ones may resist trying to look brave in front of siblings only to edge imperceptibly closer once the fire burns low. Teenagers are a category all their own. They may pretend the whole business is dull, but even they sometimes stare into the dark a little too long, listening to sounds they cannot name. Bedtime stories matter out here more than they do in comfortable houses. Indoors, a story is part of routine. On the trail, it can be a tool. A mother or older sister tells one not simply to entertain, but to lead a child's mind away from the prairie, stretching unseen beyond the firelight. Some stories are biblical, some comic, some memory fragments from home. Perhaps a tale of a dog who once stole a roast. Perhaps a village anecdote polished by repetition. Perhaps a nonsense story improvised from the day's events in which an ox becomes a judge and skillet becomes a queen. It does not need to be fine literature. It just needs to stand between a child and the dark for 10 minutes. And then there are the games before sleep. Quiet ones mostly once everyone is too tired to do much else. Guessing shapes in clouds before the last light goes. Counting stars and losing the count immediately. Hand games, whispered riddles, tiny contests over who can stay awake longest, a competition almost always won by nobody. Trail life makes toys scarce, so imagination fills the gap with professional efficiency. A blanket edge, a button, a twig, a bit of cord, all can become the centre of a serious game if the players are young enough, and the day has not crushed the spirit entirely. Yet camp at night is not all sweetness. Children cry, they wet bedding, they wake feverish, they ask hard questions at the worst possible moment. Are we almost there? Will wolves come? Why does that man cough like that? Why can we not go home? An adult on little sleep must answer or deflect while also trying to preserve the larger structure of family courage. That is no small art. Sometimes patience wins, sometimes it frays audibly around the edges. One especially revealing point from emigrant writings is that children often remembered the trail with vivid sensory fragments rather than tidy narrative. The taste of bad water, the sound of thunder on canvas, the brightness of stars, the feel of cold ground through a blanket, the terror of being briefly unable to see the wagon in dust. This makes perfect sense. Children do not always store history as adults do, they store atmosphere. Night on the trail would have been rich in exactly that kind of impression. He noticed too how children alter adult behaviour. People who might otherwise speak grimly about tomorrow's hazards lower their voices when little ears are near. A mother with nothing left in reserve still finds an extra softness for a frightened child. A father who has been all practical instruction and route talk during the day may suddenly become gentle while settling a blanket around a son's shoulders. Hardship makes tenderness more visible because it has to work harder to appear, and fear moves through camp in contagious waves. One child becomes alarmed by a sound and two others sit up instantly. A baby wakes, which wakes a sibling, which wakes a mother, which wakes the entire moral structure of the campsite. Adults learn quickly that keeping children calm is not merely a kindness. It is part of preserving any hope of rest for everyone else. So the rituals grow. A drink of water, a whispered prayer, a promise that the oxen are right there, a reminder that the stars mean the sky is clear and tomorrow may be easier. Not always true, of course, but bedtime has never required strict documentary standards. There is another side to this nighttime world as well. Children can bring lightness exactly when adults are in danger of sinking too far into worry. A child may ask whether Oregon has better pies. Another may announce with complete seriousness that one particular ox looks lonely. Someone giggles during prayers. Someone else falls asleep mid-sentence with a crust still in hand. These moments do not erase the hardship. They interrupt its monopoly. So when darkness thickens and camp begins folding itself down into blankets and shadow, you hear childhood continuing softly through it all. A murmur, a whimper, a secret little laugh. A question no one answers because the child has already drifted off. Nearby, an older sister shifts closer to two smaller siblings without being asked. Across the fire, a mother smooths hair from a hot forehead. Beyond them, the prairie is enormous, unreadable, and full of noises that adults only half trust. But inside the worn circle of camp, children keep doing what they always do. They make life messier, louder, sweeter, more fragile, and somehow more worth the trouble of getting through another night. By the time the fire burns low, rumour begins doing some of its finest work. All day the trail has given you enough real problems to occupy a strong mind. Dust sore feet wandering stock a wheel that sounded odd on the last downhill stretch. A child with a cough, a stretch of road tomorrow that someone described with far too much enthusiasm and too little accuracy. Yet evening arrives, and with it comes that special frontier habit of turning uncertainty into conversation. People gather near the dimming firelight, voices softened by fatigue, and stories start moving from wagon to wagon. A horse was nearly taken 2 camps back. Somebody heard of thieves working near a crossing. Somebody else insists a party farther east lost 3 oxen in one night, because no one kept proper watch. Truth and embellishment sit down together and share the same tin cup. This is the hour when guard duty begins to feel less like caution and more like a necessity. In many emigrant camps, especially on more crowded stretches of the trail, or in moments of heightened anxiety, men took turns standing watch through parts of the night. Sometimes the concern was livestock drifting off. Sometimes it was fear of theft. Sometimes it was generalized unease dressed up as procedure. That much is well grounded in trail accounts. Even if danger did not materialize every night, the possibility of losing oxen or horses was serious enough to justify wakeful eyes. An emigrant family could not simply shrug and say never mind if its draft animals vanished. Lose the animals and the journey itself begins to come apart, so one or two figures stay up while others settle down. They move at the edge of the fire, dark shapes against darker grass, listening for unusual sounds, checking picket lines, glancing toward the animals and trying not to let their own imaginations turn every shifting shadow into a plot. It is an odd job because it asks for alertness from a body already worn out. You have walked all day, eaten quickly, perhaps mended something by fading light, and now instead of sleep you get the privilege of standing in the cold, wondering whether that noise was an oxaman or the prairie being dramatic again. The animals are one reason enough. Oxen wander. Horses can spook. Mules, when available, often seem personally committed to disorder. A guard may spend most of his watch dealing not with thieves or attackers, but with the ordinary mischief of livestock who do not appreciate human schedules. That is another frontier comedy rarely painted in heroic scenes. The brave sentinel of the plains may in fact be chasing a determined cow away from the flour wagon, while trying not to wake the baby. A peculiar little camp tradition sometimes appears in recollections of the trail. Certain men on watch were said to sing softly, whistle, or call out at intervals, partly to reassure others they were awake, partly to comfort themselves against the uncanny feeling of standing alone in the dark. Not every party would have tolerated this, especially if the guard had a poor singing voice, which history does not kindly record. Still, the image feels right. Human beings prefer sound to emptiness when they're frightened. There is no complete consensus among historians about how intense emigrant fear of attack truly was on an average night. Some narratives written later in life heighten suspense and describe camps braced constantly for danger. Many diaries written at the time are less dramatic, focusing more on weather illness stock and fatigue than on nightly terror. Fear could be very real without being constant, and rumour could be loud without reflecting the actual odds of harm. In other words, what people dreaded and what most often disrupted their nights were not always the same thing. The talk around camp tends to exaggerate what cannot be verified. A stranger seen on a ridge becomes suspicious by the second retelling, and nearly legendary by the third. A misplaced rope becomes evidence of lurking thieves. A dog barking at nothing becomes proof of everything. You can trace the path of anxiety by listening to how details grow antlers. One person says there were riders in the distance. Another says they circled the camp. A third has them speaking in low voices and carrying intentions visible only to hindsight. This is how communities under strain fill empty space. The dark asks questions and rumour answers too quickly. At the same time, some worries are practical enough to resist mockery. Theft did happen. Livestock really could be stolen or wander off. Personal disputes within wagon companies could sour into genuine unease. Travellers carried money supplies, weapons, and all the ingredients necessary for mistrust when people were tired, crowded, and far from formal authority. The trail was not an orderly procession of saints. It was a moving collection of ordinary humans, which is far more interesting and slightly less reassuring. Guard duty also reveals a social pattern that daylight sometimes hides. Men who seem impressive in conversation are not always the men you want to wake at 2 a.m. A loud fellow with a rifle and 10 opinions may prove hopelessly distractible. A quiet farmer who says almost nothing all day may be the one who notices a loose knot, hears a distant animal before anyone else, and keeps calm when the night tries on, its little costume of menace. Hard travel has a way of redistributing respect according to usefulness. Women participate in this nighttime climate too, though not always as formal guards. A wife may wake at the slightest disturbance and listen hard before deciding whether to rouse anyone. Mothers sleep lightly because children infants, and the general unpredictability of camp do not permit deep surrender. Some women doubt the rumours and say so plainly. Others prepare for the worst by keeping clothing, shoes and children positioned for quick movement. Even in supposed rest, their alertness continues. It simply does not always get labelled as watchkeeping. One plain historical reality deserves a careful note here. Emigrant fears about indigenous attack were often magnified by prejudice rumour and wider political tensions, even though many actual encounters along the trail involve trade guidance or cautious coexistence rather than violence. That does not mean travellers never faced danger. It means that night fears were frequently shaped by stories people carried with them long before they reached a particular camp. The dark did not create those fears from nothing, but it certainly helped them grow. Then there are the internal frictions. Camp is a small society, and small societies at night can become especially delicate. A disagreement over route choices in the afternoon may still be simmering after supper. A man who drinks too much when liquor is available may become a problem after sunset. Somebody might resent pulling extra duty. Somebody else might suspect a neighbour of taking more than a fair share of grazing ground or water. Trouble does not always come from outside the firelight. Sometimes it is already in camp, snoring lightly 3 bedrolls away, and still for long stretches nothing happens. That is perhaps the strangest thing about guard duty. You stand awake in expectation and are mostly given sounds: wind brushing grass, horses shifting, a child coughing in sleep, the last collapse of a log in the fire, a bird disturbed somewhere in the dark. The mind denied actual drama begins manufacturing possibilities to justify its vigilance. You stare at shapes until they become people, and then become shrubs again. You think of home, you think of tomorrow, you think of how insultingly comfortable a real bed now seems in memory. When your watch ends and you finally lower yourself onto the blanket, you do not fall into sleep so much as drop through it. Yet even then, some part of you remains tuned to the night. A habit forms quickly out here. Sleep lightly. Listen first. Move fast if needed. Outdoor life is teaching your whole company the same lesson from different angles. Safety is not a permanent condition. It is a task renewed each evening in small, careful acts. So the rumours drift. The watchers pace the fire dims, and the camp settles under a sky too large to reassure anyone completely. Beyond the circle of sleeping bodies, the animals breathe and stamp. Somewhere in the dark, the prairie keeps its own counsel. You close your eyes, knowing that others remain awake for now, guarding not only wagons and livestock, but the fragile idea that this little collection of families' tools, blankets, children and hopes can hold together through one more uncertain night. Night is when the body begins filing complaints in detail. During the day, motion keeps you distracted. You walk, lift, guide, fetch, adjust, endure. There is always some immediate task to place between you and the unpleasant truth that your shoulders are rubbed raw. In one spot, your stomach feels questionable. Your skin is turning into a map of bites and chafing, and your lower back has started speaking in the stern voice of permanent consequences. But once the wagons stop and the camp settles into dimness, every ache comes forward like a witness eager to be heard. You notice it as soon as you lower yourself toward the blanket. The knees stiffen first, then the hips object, then some muscle along your neck, silent all day, suddenly seizes the chance to announce its own private tragedy. Sleep would be easier if the body kept its grievances to itself, but trail life seems to sharpen rather than soften them after dusk. Stillness reveals what movement concealed. A hard fact of overland travel is that illness and physical discomfort were constant companions, not occasional dramatic interruptions. People dealt with sore feet, digestive trouble, infected blisters, fever coughs, bad water, tooth pain, menstrual discomfort, sunburn, insect bites, and plain old exhaustion on a routine basis. Much of trail life happened below the level of catastrophe and above the level of comfort. That middle territory, the territory of ongoing bodily nuisance, shaped the experience of sleep just as much as the big famous hazards did. Water sits at the centre of this chapter of misery. You need it for drinking, cooking, washing and calming the hot, panicked feeling that starts in your throat after a long, dusty day. Yet the available water is often muddy, stagnant, crowded with animal traffic, or simply suspicious in ways no one can fully explain. Emigrants knew bad water could sicken them, but necessity has a way of lowering standards. If there is water, you use it. If it smells wrong, you may still use it. If it tastes like a punishing sermon, you swallow and call it providence. Some trail travellers swore by adding coffee to almost any questionable water, not purely for pleasure, but because a boiled drink felt safer than a cold one, and a bitter one felt more civilized than whatever the creek had planned. There is something wonderfully stubborn in that. Faced with the microbial uncertainty of a continent crossing, the answer becomes stronger coffee. Not a perfect medical strategy, perhaps, but emotionally excellent. Researchers examining diary evidence still wrestle with how much emigrants understood about disease transmission in practical terms. They clearly recognize dangerous conditions, foul water, and the frightening spread of illnesses like cholera, especially in certain years and stretches of the trail. What they did not have was modern germ theory in the form you would want when deciding where to draw drinking water near a crowded campsite. So they moved through a world of partial knowledge, keen observation, and desperate improvisation. They knew enough to worry, not always enough to avoid the worst. Hygiene at night becomes a matter of rationed dignity. Washing thoroughly is difficult when water is scarce or hard to carry. Soap is limited and daylight is already fading. So you wipe dust from your face with a damp cloth if you can. You rinse hands before supper if circumstances allow. You inspect blisters by firelight. You shake out socks. You examine a child's rash with tired concentration. A little cleanliness becomes an act of strategy rather than virtue. Too little, and skin breaks down, clothing chafes, and camp life grows meaner by the day. The insects certainly do not help. Mosquitoes whine around ears with a persistence that feels almost philosophical. Fleas and lice can become tormentors in crowded, repetitive travel conditions. Gnats arrive at exactly the moment you need both hands free. Bites gather at the wrists, ankles, neck, and anywhere fabric sits loosely. Scratching begins as a private habit and ends as a public chorus. You see people rubbing at the same spots all over camp, like a synchronized ritual nobody wanted to join. Then there are the less discussed discomforts, the ones polite history used to step around. Menstruation on the trail did not vanish because later storytellers found it inconvenient. Pregnancy did not pause for wagon schedules. Recovery after childbirth, urinary trouble, constipation from diet changes, and the sheer difficulty of seeking privacy for bodily needs all belong to the nightly reality of life outdoors. Social history matters here because it restores what grand adventure narratives trimmed away. The body remained a body with all its ordinary demands even in the middle of sweeping national migration. A revealing little tidbit appears now and then in personal accounts and practical advice from the era. People carried simple home remedies in astonishing variety. Camphor laudanum, peppermint vinegar, sulphur mustard, plasters, herbs, patent medicines with more confidence than evidence, and little household cures handed down through family memory all made their way west. Camp after dark could feel like an improvised pharmacy run by exhausted optimists. Whether these remedies helped harmed or merely gave people something to do, while worrying is a question that changes from case to case. Night magnifies stomach trouble in a special way. A queasy child, a father doubled briefly with cramps, someone slipping out beyond the camp line more often than dignity prefers. All of it becomes harder to manage when the ground is cold and the dark is thick. Bad food or bad water do not keep respectable hours. They arrive whenever they please. And because privacy is scarce, illness almost always becomes partly communal. Someone must fetch water. Someone must hold a lantern. Someone must sit up with the sick while others try and fail not to listen. The bed itself does not assist recovery. A feverish person lying on uneven ground under rough blankets is not exactly being cradled by medical excellence. Even minor ailments feel larger when sleep is broken and comfort is primitive. A cough sounds worse in the dark. A child's warm forehead feels hotter by firelight. Your own headache, which might have been tolerable in a house, becomes tyrannical when paired with smoke animal noise and the certainty that dawn will demand more walking whether you improve or not. Even simple toilet arrangements are a nightly trial. You wait until you cannot wait. You walk out into the dark with all the enthusiasm of a condemned actor. You hope not to step in something regrettable, startle livestock, or attract unnecessary attention. For women, this can be even more burdensome given clothing layers, modesty, and the total absence of comfort. The prairie offers vast space, and almost no privacy at all, which is really quite rude when you think about it. Another well-sported point from trail records is that many emigrants simply grew accustomed to functioning while physically depleted. They did not heal fully between discomforts. They carried half-resolved pains into the next day and the next night after that. A blister toughened, then split again. A cough eased, then returned in the dust. Shoulders rubbed raw, then calloused, then rubbed again. Endurance was not the absence of bodily failure. It was the habit of continuing through it. And yet people were attentive to one another. A woman heats water for someone with stomach trouble. A child gets the driest part of a blanket. Someone offers a pinch of herbs, a sip of coffee, a strip of cloth for binding. Men who seem stern in daylight may become surprisingly gentle when cutting moleskin for a boy's heel or lifting a sick companion into a better spot under the wagon. Care on the trail is often practical first, tender second, but it is care all the same. You begin to understand that nighttime discomfort is not a side note to the journey. It is one of the main conditions of it. The Oregon Trail is crossed not only by grand decisions and major dangers, but by thousands of little bodily negotiations. Can you sleep with that bite swelling at your wrist? Can you rise tomorrow on those blistered feet? Can you keep a child calm through a feverish night? Can you bear the smell of smoke, damp wool livestock, and unwashed humanity long enough to drift into half sleep before the mosquitoes find you again? So the camp settles, but the bodies inside it do not. They itch, ache, grumble, sweat, chill, digest badly, and carry on. Around you people turn in their blankets and suppress sighs. Someone coughs, someone whispers for water. Somewhere nearby, a mother checks a forehead in the dark. You lie still, feeling every bite, every strain, every little indignity of life lived outdoors. And slowly it becomes clear that survival on the trail is not only about avoiding disaster, it is also about enduring the nightly discomforts that never make headlines, but slowly teach you exactly how much a human frame can tolerate before morning comes and asks for more. By now the evening fire has stopped feeling optional. It is not just there for cooking, though supper still depends on it. It is not just there for warmth, though the night air on the plains has a way of slipping into sleeves, collars and moods with equal efficiency. The fire is morale routine light, and a small declaration that human beings are still attempting civilization out here, even while sleeping beside wagon wheels and calling a flattened patch of prairie home. And when timber begins to vanish from the landscape, you discover very quickly how much of your evening life rests on whatever can be burned. The treeless stretches of the plains arrive with a strange kind of openness. By day, the wide horizon can feel noble, liberating, even if your feet are not currently staging a protest. By late afternoon, however, another thought begins edging in. Where exactly is the wood for supper going to come from? Back in more settled country, fuel might be a task. Out here it becomes an obsession. You start noticing every twisted root, every broken branch near water, every scrubby bit of growth that looks even vaguely flammable. The prairie is beautiful, yes. It is also a little stingy. This is one of the practical realities recorded again and again by overland travellers. On the Great Plains, especially west of the more wooded river valleys, emigrants often had to rely on dried buffalo dung, commonly called buffalo chips, as fuel when wood was scarce. That is not a joke inserted later by schoolboys with too much free time. It is one of the plain truths of trail survival. If you wanted your coffee, your bacon, your beans, or any hope of a warm fire at dusk, you learned to look at the landscape with lowered standards and increased gratitude. And so sometime in the later afternoon somebody starts gathering chips. It is gloriously unromantic work. Children often helped, which is perhaps the most concise possible summary of frontier childhood. A little girl in a bonnet or a boy with dust to the elbows walks the grass with a sack or apron, collecting dried weathered patties left behind by buffalo herds that may or may not still be in the region. Adults do it too, of course, especially when supplies are low and hunger is persuasive. Soon the camp has a little pile of fuel that would have shocked your former self, and now seems not only acceptable but deeply reassuring. There is a wonderful frontier absurdity in how quickly people adapt to this. The first time some may wrinkle noses or exchange the look that says surely this cannot be the plan. By the third or fourth time everyone is discussing chip quality with the seriousness of connoisseurs. Too green no good. Too thin burns fast. Properly dried and well gathered, though they give a steady useful heat. Human dignity has always been more flexible than advertised. A smaller and rather amusing detail from emigrant lore is that children sometimes turned chip gathering into a competition boasting over who found the best pieces or the biggest haul, as if they were gathering apples for a county fair instead of dried buffalo leavings for the supper fire. It sounds comic, and it is, but it also tells you how families kept trail labour bearable. Turn a necessity into a game and the work moves faster. Turn it into a contest and suddenly fuel has pride attached. Interpretations differ a bit when it comes to how resentfully emigrants viewed this part of prairie life. Some diary entries treat buffalo chips matter-of-factly, almost with brisk approval once their usefulness became clear. Others mention them with distaste humour, or the sort of embarrassed surprise one feels on discovering that the West has its own opinions about refinement. That range is telling. A frontier trip did not remove sensibility. It merely forced it to coexist with need, and the fire itself does behave differently depending on what you are burning. Wood has one smell, one crackle, one kind of flame. Buffalo chips offer another. The smoke can be sharper, the heat steady but distinctive, the whole business somehow more solemnly practical. Yet when the evening air cools and the pot begins to steam, nobody wastes too much time longing for the superior aesthetics of hardwood. The beans do not care, the coffee certainly does not. This changes the rhythm of camp. In wooded places, evening fuel gathering may be a matter of collecting branches or breaking up deadfall. On the open plains, the search becomes broader, lower, more attentive to what the land has actually provided rather than what you wish it had. Trail life repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Sentiment is charming until supper depends on reality. Then reality wins in a landslide. Women again feel the consequences most directly near the fire. The fuel available determines how long a pot can simmer, how evenly bread can cook, whether coffee is worth attempting, whether damp clothes can be coaxed toward dryness, whether children have enough warmth before bed. If the fire's weak, everything becomes harder. Meals are rushed or half done. Camp feels colder at the edges. Clean-up becomes meaner. A low flame can pull the whole mood of evening down with it. A decent blaze, by contrast, can make hardship briefly seem organised. Children remember these fires too. The odd smell, the pleasure of warmth after wind, the glow on wagon covers. The feeling of being called close while a parent turns something in a skillet. Family memory often keeps sensory details better than logistics, and you can understand why. A buffalo chip fire is not elegant, but it is unforgettable. It becomes one of those frontier facts that stays lodged in the mind, because it is so concrete, so strange to later ears, and so utterly normal once you have lived with it. It also says something important about the land before emigrants. The presence of buffalo chips as fuel is a quiet reminder that these plains are not empty. They have ecological systems, animal migrations, and older human knowledge built into them. Indigenous peoples knew this country intimately long before wagon parties arrived improvising their way through supper. The emigrants are adapting, yes, but often to conditions and uses of the landscape that were hardly new. What feels like novelty to them is frequently long-standing practice in another frame. Evenings without enough fuel can be bleak in a very specific way. You cannot linger comfortably by the fire. Food takes longer or turns out worse. Light fades faster. Conversation shortens because everyone is conserving heat and patience. The camp seems more exposed. That may be why a good fuel supply, however humble its source, feels like abundance. Not luxury exactly, but competence. Preparedness. One more night that can be managed. One plain historical note often overlooked in polished retellings is that emigrants sometimes grew skilled enough at using buffalo chips that they preferred them in certain conditions, especially when wood was damp or non-existent. Necessity can begin as disgust and end as expertise. That transformation may be one of the deepest themes of the trail altogether. You arrive with assumptions and the road edits them line by line. By now you've likely started noticing how many evening comforts depend on invisible earlier work. The fire that glows now required gathering before dusk. The coffee that warms your hands needed water-carried pot-cleaned grounds measured. The bedroll that feels almost tolerable needed airing, shaking and protecting from dew. Nothing in camp simply appears. Each little mercy has been assembled from labour foresight and whatever raw material the prairie was willing to surrender. So the flames rise from this unlikely fuel, and the camp closes around them with gratitude that does not bother dressing itself in elegance. Smoke drifts low. The pot mutters softly. A child edges nearer to the heat until told not that near. Someone jokes that the buffalo continues serving civilization long after leaving the scene. Tired laughter answers. Above you the sky darkens into its great cold theatre, while below on the plain a circle of families keeps itself alive with dung determination, and the old human refusal to let the evening go dark without one more warm drink, and one more chance to pretend that tomorrow will be simpler than today. By the time you stop near a river crossing, your nerves are already tired before the evening even begins. Rivers do that to a wagon party. They unsettle the whole day, then follow everyone into the night. Long before you reach the bank, people have started talking about depth current ferry prices, broken tongues, drowned oxen from somebody else's story, and whether the bed of the river is firm or soft or treacherous, in that particularly frontier way that makes all three sound possible at once. Water on the trail is never just scenery. A quiet stream may offer relief washing and a decent camp. A wide river can turn breakfast optimism into evening silence. When the crossing itself comes, the whole company sharpens. Loads are shifted. Wagon beds may be corked if there's hope of floating one safely. Animals are checked, ropes handled, children lifted or hushed, and everyone suddenly discovers fresh opinions about engineering. Some crossings are made by ford, which mean driving through if the water is judged manageable. Others require ferries, rafts, hired assistants, or a great deal of prayer wrapped in practical motion. The exact method depends on the river, the season, the condition of the company, and how much risk people are willing to dress up as confidence. A solid fact from the overland trail era is that river crossings were among the most dreaded parts of the journey, not only because they could kill, but because they could destroy supplies, delay progress, and shatter morale in one wet afternoon. Wagon trains faced countless streams and several major rivers on the way west, and journals often pause over these moments with an intensity that tells you everything. Crossing water demanded teamwork, judgment, luck, and nerves that could keep functioning while the current tried to embarrass everyone involved. If you ford, the scene is rarely graceful. Oxen lean into their harnesses with offended sincerity. Wheels sink, lurch then roll again. Water climbs higher than you would prefer. A child cries because the wagon is tilting, and because children possess excellent instincts for drama. Someone shouts directions nobody fully hears. Men wade beside the wagon, trousers, soaked boots filling faces arranged in the expression of people who would like to appear calm for the benefit of others and are not entirely succeeding. Everything seems to move both too slowly and too fast. If you ferry, the anxiety only changes costume. Now you must trust ropes, planks, balance, and the competence of men whose confidence may or may not deserve its own volume. Animals must sometimes be driven to swim or loaded separately. Wagons creak aboard with suspicious sounds. Families stand on the bank watching possessions that contain their whole future drift over water on machinery that looks temporary even by frontier standards. There is a unique helplessness in seeing your world afloat while you wait your turn. Or one strange and memorable detail from trail accounts is how often emigrants describe the specific sight of floating household objects after an accident. A barrel rolling loose a chair leg briefly visible, a box bobbing downstream bedding spread and dark and heavy in the water. It is one thing to lose property in the abstract. It is another to watch your own domestic life drift away piece by piece, like a badly organised yard sale staged by the river itself. That visual stayed with people because it was absurd and devastating at the same time. Interpretations vary when historians consider how much good judgment emigrants typically used at crossings. Some parties waited measured, consulted scouts and acted with real care. Others rushed out of impatience, overconfidence, or plain exhaustion with delay. The diary record shows both caution and foolishness, sometimes within the same company on the same day. Water has a special talent for exposing character. The prudent become more prudent. The impulsive become expensive. And then evening comes after all that. This may be the most revealing part. Once the crossing is over, whether successful, messy, delayed, or nearly disastrous, camp must still be made. Supper must still happen. Bedding must still be spread. If clothes are wet, they must be wrung, shaken, hung, draped, or worn until body heat and wind argue them toward dryness. If flour got damp, meal planning changes instantly. If a box broke open, contents must be sorted in the failing light. Nobody gets to say the day has already been dramatic enough, let us cancel chores. The trail never accepts that reasoning. The smell of a post-river camp is different. Wet wool, mud, riverweed on boots, leather soaked through, smoke from a hurried fire trying valiantly to catch with half-damp fuel. Someone's coffee tastes better than it has any right to because it is hot, and because surviving water makes heat feel earned. Children are often quieter after a hard crossing, either frightened, overexcited, or too exhausted to continue ordinary rebellion. Adults move with that jerky, determined efficiency people acquire when they are suppressing what might have happened. Women bear a particular share of the aftermath. Wet garments must be dealt with before children chill. Food stores have to be checked. Blankets rescued from dampness if possible. A baby who cried through the whole crossing now wants comfort with complete sincerity and inconvenient timing. A mother may still have river water in her skirts while trying to coax a fire into usefulness. A teenage girl helps spread clothing on bushes or wagon bows. An older woman counts utensils, counts, children counts, blessings perhaps not in that order. There's also a hush that comes after near danger, a kind of emotional low tide. Camp talk may briefly lose its usual joking surface. People sit with cups in hand and stare into the fire as if watching their nerves settle there. A father who barked instructions all afternoon now speaks gently to a child. A man who nearly slipped with the lead ox says almost nothing for an hour. Someone laughs too suddenly about a floating wash basin, and the laugh has relief inside it, not humour. A practical point recorded in numerous emigrant accounts is that riverbanks often made imperfect camps despite the need to stop nearby. Insects could be worse there. Ground could be muddy. Moisture settled heavily. Yet proximity to water also meant washing opportunities, stock access, and sheer necessity when a crossing took longer than planned. So families often accepted a poor night's sleep because the geography of the day left little room for elegance. River camps could be useful and miserable in equal measure. There is another element too quieter but powerful. Crossings remind everyone how thin the margin is between endurance and catastrophe. On an ordinary day, you can almost believe the trail is a long, hard routine. A river interrupts that fantasy. Suddenly the whole enterprise is fragile. A slipped wheel, a panicked animal, a box poorly tied, and home, hope and supper all begin floating away. Afterward, even with success behind you, that awareness lingers. It lies down beside you at night like an extra unwanted blanket. Children feel it in their own ways. Some become talkative, retelling the event with dramatic improvements. Others grow clingy at bedtime, asking if another river is tomorrow. One may boast that he was not scared at all, which means he was. Another falls asleep instantly from the sheer emotional expense of the day. Adults perform the same range more discreetly. One becomes cheerful by force. Another goes very quiet. Another rechecks knots and gear with unnecessary thoroughness, because hands need something to do when the mind is still crossing the water. So when you finally lie down after a river day, the body feels unusually heavy and the mind unusually alert. You can still sense the pull of current in your legs. You can hear the shouting again, the splashing, the creak of wood, the breath of straining animals. Nearby damp clothes hang from wagon bows like surrendered flags. The fire smokes low, mud dries stiff on boots. The night air cools whatever the river left wet. And as the camp settles along the bank, grateful and shaken, you understand why water remained in so many trail memories. Not merely as obstacle, but as the thing that reached into evening, soaked the bedroll and reminded every soul there how much depended on getting one wagon, one child, one ox, one tired family safely to the other side. By this point, nobody on the trail is truly alone, which can be comforting right up until it becomes exhausting. A wagon journey compresses human life in the strangest way. Back home, love affairs, quarrels, griefs, little private embarrassments and long marriages all have rooms to hide in. On the Oregon Trail, almost everything happens within earshot of children, neighbours' livestock, and one deeply observant old woman who misses absolutely nothing. The prairie is enormous, yet social life becomes close-packed. That is one of the quiet ironies of the journey. You cross vast open spaces while living inches from other people's moods. The day's labour leaves everyone stripped down to essentials. Politeness remains certainly, but it wears thinner than it did in town. A husband and wife who once argued through doors now argue through lowered voices by the dying fire. A young couple trying to flirt must do so under the supervision of parents, siblings, and half the company's peripheral hearing. Widows carry sorrow into camp, where there is no private corner large enough to contain it. New friendships form over shared kettles, borrowed needles, and the simple intimacy of seeing someone else at their worst and realizing they are still kind. This is one of the social facts that becomes very clear in emigrant diaries. The overland trail placed families and unrelated travellers in sustained close proximity for months, and that closeness intensified both cooperation and conflict. People who might have remained mere acquaintances in settled life became companions, rivals, caretakers, irritants, even unofficial kin. The trail did not create human feeling from scratch, it accelerated it. You see it first in the small acts of attachment. A man checks whether his wife has enough blanket before he lies down himself. A teenage girl braids her younger sister's hair by firelight because dust has made it a hopeless tangle. A boy offers the least broken biscuit to a child who cried through supper. Somebody keeps a place warm by the fire for an older woman whose knees are not forgiving. These are not grand romantic gestures. They are the daily evidence that affection survives rough handling. Courtship too finds a way. It always does. Somewhere in camp, a young man walks a little farther than necessary to fetch water because he knows a certain young woman will be helping with the cups. A girl looks up from mending only once, but that once is enough. They speak in the safe language of tasks. Pass the kettle. Mind the child. Is your mother feeling better? On a trail like this, flirtation has to travel in work clothes. Privacy is scarce. Propriety still matters, and every glance has an audience whether invited or not. There are stories from the overland period of marriages performed en route sometimes by clergy, travelling with a company sometimes by officials or respected figures encountered along the way, sometimes in arrangements as practical as the journey itself. It makes sense. Life does not suspend its ordinary milestones simply because the ground beneath them is dusty and the wedding guests are holding tin cups. If anything, hardship can make emotional decisions feel more urgent. The future looks uncertain, so people reach for what can be claimed now. An amusing little detail from frontier reminiscence is that some courting couples manage brief moments alone by volunteering for tasks nobody else wanted, like gathering fuel at the edge of camp or walking livestock a short distance. It is almost sweet enough to forgive the obvious strategy. Nothing inspires creative romance quite like 6 months of zero privacy and a wagon full of relatives. Writers who study overland family life are not entirely of one mind about whether the trail strengthened marriages overall or simply exposed the cracks already there. Some evidence suggests shared hardship could deepen loyalty and admiration. Other accounts show fatigue, grief, money worries, pregnancy loss, and authority struggles pressing hard on already fragile relationships. Most likely the trail did what pressure often does. It revealed what was solid and what had only looked solid under gentler weather. Nighttime especially lays relationships bare. Once chores are done and the fire sinks lower, there is less performance left in anyone. A couple may sit side by side in silence that feels warm and companionable, or in silence that has sharp corners. A parent may stroke a sleeping child's hair with tenderness intensified by the day's dangers. Someone recently widowed may turn away from camp before lying down because all the domestic pairings around them have become newly unbearable. The dark lets emotions slip out with less ceremony. Grief travels with remarkable persistence on the trail. People have left homes, parents, siblings, graves, familiar fields, churchyards, streets, and routines behind. Some are escaping debt or disappointment. Some are carrying fresh mourning into the journey itself. There may be a baby's empty place in one family memory, a dead brother's knife in another, house sold too cheaply, a town left with anger. At night, when movement stops, these absences reappear. The prairie is wide enough to hold memory, unfortunately, and it does so with skill. Women often bear the emotional architecture of camp with extraordinary steadiness. They comfort children, cushion men's pride when possible, keep rituals alive, mark birthdays if they can, and improvise gentleness in places not designed for it. Men do emotional labour too, of course, though often in different forms. A father keeps watch longer than needed because it helps him feel useful. A husband repairs something by lantern light because fixing a wheel is easier than speaking about fear. Care does not always announce itself as tenderness. Sometimes it arrives disguised as work. The trail also makes loneliness more visible, not less. A single man may sit a little outside the family circles after supper, welcome enough but not woven into anyone's nightly routine. A widow may receive kindness all around and still feel the gap beside her like a second landscape. An older child may suddenly seem apart from the younger ones and not yet included among the adults. Shared travel does not erase solitude. It only changes its outline. One practical truth noted in many personal accounts is that families often slept close together for warmth, reassurance, and sheer necessity. Children clustered near mothers. Married couples lay side by side or in whatever arrangement the wagon weather and ground allowed. That closeness could be comforting, but it also meant every cough-toss whispered disagreement, and midnight worry spread through the domestic circle. Intimacy on the trail was constant but not always gentle. Quarrels naturally did not vanish because everyone was tired. In fact, fatigue is a marvellous fertilizer for irritation. Someone packed the wrong thing. Someone forgot the dipper. Someone drove the oxen too hard. Someone let the coffee boil over. A husband gives an instruction in the tone that means this could have been said more kindly. A wife answers in the tone that means it certainly could have. Yet even arguments have to coexist with necessity. Supper still needs making, the child still needs settling, the storm still needs preparing for. Frontier life rarely grants the luxury of a dramatic exit. You cannot storm out properly when the whole horizon belongs to all of you, and sometimes in the middle of all this compression, tenderness grows stranger and stronger. You notice a couple who have stopped speaking much, but move around each other with perfect practical grace. One hands the other a cup without looking. One lifts the blanket edge for the other at bedtime. Love may not always look like poetry here. Often it looks like remembering where the dry socks are. The fire drops lower. Voices soften. Somewhere nearby, two young people laugh briefly at something no one else hears. A mother hums to an overtired child. A man sits staring into embers a little longer than necessary because he misses someone he cannot name aloud. Another reaches for his wife's hand in the dark where nobody can quite see it. The camp is full of these quiet attachments and aches all pressed close together under the same sky. So when you lie down tonight, the ground beneath you is still hard, the blanket still smells of dust and smoke, and the prairie beyond the wagons is as indifferent as ever. Yet inside the little world of camp hearts keep doing what they always do. They cling, ache, hope, resent, forgive, flirt, grieve, and keep watch over one another in the dark. The trail strips away walls, distance, and pretense, leaving people very near to one another indeed, which is sometimes a burden, sometimes a comfort, and very often both at once. The mountains announce themselves long before you are fully inside them. At first they rise far off, pale and improbable, like something painted onto the edge of the world to test your sincerity. Then day by day they grow substance. Their lines sharpen, their shadows deepen, the air changes. The road begins to tilt, then twist, then ask entirely different questions of wagon, animal and body. You have spent so long with open sky and broad plains that the first real feeling of enclosure can seem almost emotional. The land is no longer merely wide. It is vertical, watchful, and considerably less interested in your convenience. By the time camp is made in the higher country, evening feels different from the first minute. The wind has teeth now. Light drains faster behind ridges. What looked like a harmless breeze in late afternoon turns to a cold, thorough inspection of every weak seam in your clothing once the sun drops. You kneel at the fire and feel one side of your body warmed, while the other remains in negotiation with the altitude. The familiar routine of supper bedding and stock care continues, but it happens in sharper air, with stiffer fingers and a stronger sense that the night will not be forgiving. One plain truth from overland accounts is that mountain travel could bring bitter cold, even when lower stretches of the trail have been hot and dusty. Emigrants moving into the Blue Mountains or later through parts of the Columbia Corridor and other elevated terrain often faced colder camps, rougher sleeping conditions and the need for more fuel and tighter bedding management. Altitude was not simply scenic variety, it was a different mode of hardship. The body already worn by months of travel had to adapt again, and the body notices immediately. Breath comes a bit shorter on climbs. Legs feel heavier by evening, as though each step has acquired a private tax. Fires matter more because the cold begins working on you before you are fully still. If the air is damp as well, the chill seems to enter through cuffs and boot leather, rather than strike from outside. Children curl inward earlier. Older travellers move a little more carefully around camp, aware that a stumble here can cost more than embarrassment. Everything gains edges. There is an odd little detail in some emigrant recollections that high country nights could make blankets crackle faintly with frost by dawn, especially late in the season or in exposed camps. Imagine that after months of dust and heat. You fall asleep thinking only of rest and wake to find the world silvered, the wagon cover stiffened and your breath visible in the first grey light. It is the trail's way of reminding you that climate is less a background condition than a collection of ambushes. Those who study overland migration do not all agree on how psychologically difficult the transition into mountain country felt for most emigrants. Some writings suggest relief because higher ground could mean cooler days' timber and a sense of nearing the end. Other accounts reveal dread, especially when steep grades, cold camps, and the threat of early snow entered the conversation. Both responses make sense. Mountains offer beauty and menace in the same silhouette. You can admire them all afternoon and resent them by supper. The fire changes character here too. In the plains, it was often a treasured convenience held together by scavenged fuel or buffalo chips. In the mountains, timber may be more available in some places, which sounds like pure luxury, until you remember that gathering it can mean scrambling over uneven ground with tired legs, while daylight disappears at insulting speed. A larger fire may be possible, but so is a greater need for it. Warmth is no longer a comfort that improves morale. It is nearly a structure of evening itself. Without it, everything feels thinner. You also start hearing new sounds in the dark. Wind through trees rather than grass. Branches answering one another overhead. Water rushing somewhere below camp if you are near a stream. Animals shifting with an uneasiness different from the plains, reacting to scents and shadows carried oddly in the timber. The mountains seem to hold sound, then throw it back altered. A crack in the woods may be only a branch settling, yet it arrives with enough authority to keep half the camp awake for 10 unnecessary minutes. Women's work after sundown grows no lighter here. If anything, cold adds new urgency to every familiar task. Wet socks must be brought near enough to heat to improve, but not so near that they scorch. Children need layering, wrapping, checking. Supper has to be warm if at all possible, because warmth inside the body matters more now than ever. Bedding must be organised with strategy, not merely habit. The labour of making camp livable becomes more exact. A mistake of placement or timing means a colder night for everyone. Children often respond to the mountains with a complicated mixture of awe and complaint. During the day they may point at pines, cliffs, rushing water, or patches of old snow with real excitement. By bedtime they are merely cold, overtired and offended by the concept of uneven ground. A little one cries because her hands hurt from chill. Another wants to know whether bears are listening nearby. An older child insists he's not cold while shaking visibly. The mountains turn bravery into theatre very quickly. A practical note found in many trail recollections is that emigrants feared being caught too late in the season by snow in the high country. That fear was not melodrama. Timing mattered intensely on western routes. A cold night in the mountains was not just a hard night. It could be part of a larger calculation about whether the whole company was moving fast enough to avoid worse weather ahead. So even as the camp settles, that worry lies awake in more than one mind. Cold carries a calendar inside it. There is also the matter of fatigue layered on fatigue. By the time you reach these elevations, you're not a fresh traveller encountering difficulty for the first time. You are months into the journey. Shoes are worn, patience is worn, the novelty reserve is badly depleted. So mountain hardship lands on people already thinned by repetition. A steep day ends, and there is less emotional padding left. That is why a cold campsite can feel disproportionately bleak. It is never only about the temperature, it is about everything the company has already spent to get there. Yet beauty keeps interfering. That may be the most irritatingly magnificent thing about these nights. The pines darken against a fading sky in stately ranks. Peaks catch the last light while camp is already in shadow. The stars appear between black branches like lanterns hung very high. The fire glows brighter against the tree trunks. Smoke rises almost straight for a moment in the still cold air before the wind takes it. You may be exhausted enough to resent beauty on principle, and it still gets in. The West refuses to stop being beautiful simply because you're cold and annoyed. There is also relief in timbered country for some travellers. Wood shelter from the open sweep of the plains, running water, a sense of being in a place with shape and contour rather than endless exposure. After so much horizon, the mountains can feel intimate, though not kindly so. The land closes around you. Camp becomes tucked into hollows and edges rather than exposed under the whole sky. Some find that comforting. Others miss being able to see trouble coming from half a day away. When you lie down now, the ground seems harder because cold sharpens every contact point. The blanket is tucked close under your shoulders. Your coat may stay on. Boots might be placed where they will not freeze or soak if dew turns mean. Nearby children are bundled like parcels. Someone feeds the fire once more. A horse stamps and blows steam into the darkness. Beyond the wagons, the trees stand in black patience, and above them the stars seem colder than those of the plains, though that may only be your fingers deciding to editorialize. Sleep comes lightly in such air. You drift wakeless and pull the blanket tighter and drift again. Morning will be raw and grey and will ask your body to climb once more. But for now, the camp crouches in the mountain night holding warmth. Close, feeling the high, cold press from all sides and understanding with a fresh shiver that the trail has changed again. The open plains taught you how vast the journey was. The mountains teach you how thin warmth is, how quickly dusk can turn to bitter dark, and how much courage it takes simply to lie down on hard ground and trust that dawn will find you still moving west. After so many nights of raw ground smoke in your hair and supper made from patience as much as food, a fort or trading post begins to feel almost mythical. You hear about them before you see them naturally. Someone farther up the line says there is a post ahead with flour, maybe coffee, maybe blacksmith work, maybe actual walls, maybe a chance to hear news from the east that is not three rumours wrapped in one another like bad blankets. By the time the buildings finally rise into view, they seem less like architecture and more like an emotional event. Timber walls, storehouses, voices not entirely shaped by your own wagon party, perhaps livestock pens, perhaps the sharp ring of metal on metal. After weeks or months of open camps, a built place has a strange power. It makes the heart sit up. There were indeed forts and trading posts along important stretches of the overland routes, and they served many purposes. Some provided repair supplies, mail handling medical aid in limited form information, and a point of exchange for emigrants, traders, soldiers, missionaries, and indigenous people. Places such as Fort Laramie and Fort Hall became major reference points in emigrant memory. That is not because they were luxurious. Usually they were not. It is because on a journey measured in exposure, any semi-stable centre of human order feels immense. You do not arrive looking noble. Nobody does. The company comes in dusty stiff underslept and immediately alert to possibility. Can an axle be fixed? Can flour be bought? Is there vinegar? Are there nails? Is there coffee worth the price? Has anyone heard what the trail ahead is like? You can feel the camp mind shift from endurance to acquisition. Even if you are cautious with money, even if you know prices may be outrageous, even if the whole place smells like stock trade sweat and disappointment, The relief is unmistakable. Here is a place where goods do not have to be invented out of absence. A small but delightful detail recorded in several overland recollections is how exciting ordinary baked bread or fresh vegetables could seem when available near a post. Not grand banquets, not silver service. Just something not dried salted or repeatedly boiled into compliance. A fresh onion or decent loaf could take on the emotional significance of a religious sign. Frontier appetite has a way of clarifying values. Opinions among historians are varied when it comes to how helpful these posts truly were to emigrants. Some accounts remember them as vital anchors, places of repair and morale, where news and provisions helped keep a company functioning. Other records emphasize inflated prices, limited stocks, and the disappointment of discovering that a famous post could not possibly solve every problem a wagon party had dragged in with it. Both impressions ring true. Hope tends to over-furnish places that sell coffee. Still, the social charge of such a stop is extraordinary. New faces mean new stories. News from eastbound travellers means warnings, gossip, weather reports, tales of cholera, whispered prices and debates over which route is best. Men cluster around blacksmith work or animals. Women inspect supplies with the fierce concentration of people who know exactly how much domestic survival depends on small purchases. Children stare at everything. Dogs, carts, soldiers, if any are present. Traders barrels odd goods from far places. Strangers with unfamiliar accents. The whole scene feels almost theatrical after the repetitive intimacy of trail camp. And yet the very presence of walls can make the next outdoor night harder rather than easier. That is the cruel little twist. After a taste of structure, the prairie seems more exposed. After standing in the lee of actual buildings, the wind outside feels more personal. If you manage even a little rest near a fort under partial shelter, or simply with a sense that there are people, stores and roofs nearby, then returning to open ground can sting. Comfort does not merely soothe, it also sharpens your awareness of its absence once taken away again. Women often experience these stops in particularly layered ways. On one hand, there may be a chance to replenish household necessities, seek help, compare prices, ask after medicines, or simply stand for a brief moment in a place that resembles organized life. On the other hand, the post can expose scarcity all over again. You see what you lack, because here briefly goods exist in visible form. Needles, cloth, kettles, flour, shoes, soap. Desire becomes itemized. Then comes the reckoning with what can actually be afforded or carried. There is also the matter of news, which is both nourishing and disruptive. A letter, if one miraculously appears, can steady a person or undo them completely. Even verbal reports from the East can stir homesickness in ways the routine of travel had kept buried. Someone hears of a town event months late and laughs. Another hears of sickness back home and goes quiet. Someone learns that prices in Oregon are better or worse than expected, and begins recalculating the future before supper. Information like coffee is excellent until it keeps you awake. One well-attested feature of many posts was their role as crossroads of many worlds, not merely emigrant life. Traders, indigenous visitors, military personnel, missionaries, mountain men, teamsters, and families bound in different directions all pass through or around them. So when you stop there, you're not stepping into a neat emigrant service station. You are entering a more tangled frontier society, one full of commerce negotiation, misunderstanding opportunity, and sometimes outright tension. For a traveller who has lately known only the routines of one moving company, this can feel exciting and slightly overwhelming. A rather charming tidbit from trail memory is that children sometimes treated a fort stop as if it were a holiday even when the adults were busy bargaining, repairing, and worrying. The sight of more people, more animals, more objects, perhaps even the rare treat of something sweet or fresh, could transform the atmosphere entirely for them. A place adults experienced as a practical halt might live in a child's memory as a marvel of barrels and boots. By evening, however, even at a post the old realities return. You may still be outside. You may still be cooking over a rough fire. Perhaps the wind is cut a little. Perhaps the ground is marginally better. Perhaps you have managed to buy coffee mend a wagon part or hear reassuring news. All of that helps. None of it changes the deeper truth that the trail remains mostly a life outdoors. A fort is punctuation, not salvation. That said, punctuation matters when a sentence is this long. The mood in camp after leaving a post is often curiously mixed. Spirits rise because supplies are better, wheels are fixed and information has been gathered. At the same time, some people feel newly uneasy. Prices may have reduced hard cash. Fresh rumours may have arrived. Someone may have seen a better wagon and begun resenting their own. Someone else may have heard that the next stretch is rougher than expected. Relief and apprehension sit side by side in the same bedroll. You feel it especially at night after a day near buildings. The open air seems bigger. The dark beyond the fire seems less companionable. For a few hours you stood among walls, trade and concentrated human life. Now you're once again under the sky, with only canvas, wheels and habit between yourself and the land. The contrast sharpens everything. Smoke smells stronger. Ground feels harder. The silence after the noise of a post rings in the ears, and yet there is strength in moving on. A stop at a fort reminds you that the world is larger than your wagon circle, that other travellers have passed this way, that goods can be bought, repairs made, information exchanged, and the journey broken into points rather than one endless ribbon. Human beings need markers. They need places that say you have come this far. Tomorrow, perhaps you will go farther still. So as the fire settles and the company lies down again in the open with perhaps a repaired wheel, a little fresh flour, a few new rumours and a renewed ache for walls they cannot carry west, you understand why forts lingered so vividly in emigrant memory. They were not simply supply stops. They were brief encounters with solidity. And that made the next night outside feel both easier because help had been found, and harder because now you remembered all over again what shelter feels like. Death doesn't stop the wagons for long, which may be the hardest truth the trail teaches. You feel it first in the altered sound of camp. Not silence exactly, because there are still animals to tend fires, to light children to feed and pans to scrape. But something in the rhythm goes taut. Voices stay lower. Movement becomes careful in a way that has nothing to do with tiredness. Somebody has died or is dying, or everyone fears that by morning the question will be answered. On the Oregon Trail, grief rarely arrives with the courtesy of spare time. It enters camp while supper still needs making. By now you know that hardship has many scales. There is the ordinary misery of dust-damp blankets, bad coffee, sore feet, and interrupted sleep. Then there is the sudden larger sorrow that changes how the firelight falls on every face. A child burning with fever through the afternoon. A man who never recovered from a river crossing chill. A woman weakened by months of strain, poor water worry, and too little rest. Sometimes death comes after visible decline. Sometimes it seems to arrive indecently fast, leaving the company blinking as if the day itself has broken a rule. One firmly established fact of the overland migration is that many travellers died on the trail from disease accidents, and exhaustion-related illnesses, with cholera being especially feared in certain years. Graves lined parts of the route, though the exact number has always been difficult to pin down. Emigrants saw burial places often enough that the site entered trail memory as the part of the landscape. This is not an added dramatic flourish. It is one of the defining realities of going west overland. The trail to Oregon was also unmistakably a road of mourning, and yet even in mourning practical life refuses to excuse itself. A grave must be dug if the ground allows it. Clothing or a blanket must be arranged. Someone says a prayer, perhaps formal, perhaps not. Someone else keeps children back or explains as gently as possible what has happened. Livestock still need water. If the death occurs late in the day, camp may hold around the fresh mound overnight. If it happens in the morning, the party may be moving again by afternoon, leaving one person in the earth and the rest still pointed west. That pace can sound brutal to later ears, but the trail offered little alternative. Food could not cook itself. Weather did not wait respectfully. Animals did not stand in spiritual solidarity. The journey had already demanded too much to pause for long. A smaller but haunting detail appears in many recollections. Some emigrants attempted to disguise graves by burying the dead in or near the road itself, so that wagon wheels and animal traffic would obscure the sight, partly to deter disturbance by scavengers or grave robbers. Whether every remembered instance happened exactly as later described is difficult to know, but the practice is widely associated with trail burial traditions and shows the harsh practicality involved. Even remembrance had to bargain with the landscape. Interpretations differ when scholars examine how openly grief could be expressed in emigrant companies. Some diaries record raw sorrow, lingering references to loss, and emotional language that cuts through the plainness of the rest of the entry. Other accounts are startlingly brief, mentioning a death in one line before moving immediately to mileage, weather, or supper. That does not necessarily mean feeling was absent. It may instead show how necessity compressed expression. When the living still have to make camp by sundown, grief is often written in shorthand. Night after a burial carries a peculiar weight. The same fire burns, the same children ask for food, the same oxen breathe and stamp in the dark. But the camp's emotional geometry has changed. A place beside one wagon is empty. A familiar cough is missing. A mother's hands continue working while her face has gone remote. Men who are brisk all day sit longer than usual before speaking. Even laughter, if it comes, arrives carefully as though asking permission to exist. Women often bear much of the burden of keeping life moving in these moments. A child whose sibling died still needs washing and holding. Bread still has to be mixed. A husband who has buried his wife may not know where everything was packed, how the children settle best, or how supper has been managed for the last 4 months. Another woman in camp may step in quietly bringing food, taking a baby, mending something, or saying very little, because little is useful. Grief on the trail is communal whether people want it to be or not. Children encounter death in a way that can seem both blunt and bewildered. Some ask direct questions no adult feels ready to answer. Some grow solemn and quiet, watching the faces of older people for instructions on how to feel. Others return to play with shocking speed, which can look heartless until you remember that childhood does not grieve by the rules adults prefer. A game resumes near a fresh sorrow, because children move in and out of grief as naturally as they move in and out of light. One detail from personal reminiscences that stays with you is how often ordinary objects become charged after a death. A cup that belonged to the dead, a shawl folded away, a Bible laid near the wagon seat, a small shoe, a knife. The trail strips possessions down to necessity, so whatever remains carries extra weight. There is no large house to absorb memory. It lives in the packed things in the hand you reach for out of habit, in the task someone else suddenly has to do. A notable pattern in emigrant records is that burial places were often marked simply if at all, because time, danger, weather, and the need to continue limited what could be done. A rough board, a carved name if there was time, a few stones of private memory. Many graves were left with little permanent trace. That is part of what makes the trail feel so ghosted in hindsight. People passed, loved, worked, suffered, died, and were folded into the land with very little ceremony compared with the size of the loss. The moral strain of moving on could be severe. A husband may feel guilty for leaving a wife behind in the earth of some unfamiliar place. A mother may lie awake after burying a child and still have to rise before dawn because the company cannot remain. Others in camp may question whether to continue west at all, only to realize that going back is also a journey, and perhaps an even worse one. The trail does not merely ask what you can endure physically. It asks what kind of emotional debt you can carry while still walking, and the dead remain present after the wagons roll, not as sentimental apparitions, perhaps, though some surely felt them that way, but in conversation, caution, and altered routines. Someone says, "Remember what happened at the last river." Someone notices a cough sooner than before. A mother checks a feverish forehead with a little more dread. A family rearranges itself around an absence. The company learns grimly that people can vanish from the evening circle, and the circle will still have to close. There is also strangely a deepening of tenderness after death brushes near. A man wraps a blanket more carefully around his sleeping child. A woman reaches for her husband's hand in the dark without comment. Families gather closer by the fire. Harsh words are withheld, at least for a night. The presence of mortality makes ordinary attachment glow more clearly, as if the camp was suddenly lit from beneath by all the fragility people usually try not to name. So when you lie down tonight, the air feels heavier, though nothing visible has changed much. The stars still wheel above, the animals still stir, someone banks the fire. Beyond the camp, the prairie or mountains keep their impassive shape. But inside the ring of blankets and wagons, one space is altered forever. Tomorrow the road will resume its dull, relentless demands, and the company will obey because it must. Yet for this one night, the trail reveals its sharpest lesson. Life continues not because sorrow is small, but because survival leaves so little room for stopping. And there beside the faint heat of the embers, with grief resting among the kettles and bedrolls like another unseen traveller, you understand how the Oregon Trail could make people practical without ever making them unfeeling. By the time you've come this far, you understand that the trail is not an empty road laid out for your arrival. It never was. The land ahead and around you has names, paths, memories, seasonal rhythms, trading networks, and peoples who know it in ways your wagon party does not. Yet many emigrants travel as though moving through blank space, which is one of the stranger habits of people carrying maps into someone else's homeland. You see the contradiction constantly. Travellers depend on local knowledge trade opportunities and information gathered from indigenous people, then return to camp and speak as if they are pressing into wilderness untouched by human intelligence. The prairie hears this, and one imagines rolls its eyes. Encounters with native people along the Oregon Trail could range from brief observation at a distance to trade guidance, curiosity, mutual caution, misunderstanding, and at times genuine tension. That much is firmly grounded in the record. Emigrant diaries, army reports, missionary writings, and later recollections all make clear that indigenous nations were a central part of trail experience, not a decorative side note. The route-crossed lands connected to many communities, including Pawnee, Lakota, Shoshone, Cayuse, Nez Perce, and others, depending on the stretch. The emigrants were never moving through emptiness. They were moving through inhabited worlds, and yet the campfire version of these meetings is often uneven. By day, a family might trade for fish routes or guidance across a rough stretch. By night, the same camp might murmur anxiously about danger motives or intentions they barely understand. Fear and dependence sit side by side. So do gratitude and prejudice. This is one of the most revealing parts of the trail story because it shows emigrants carrying their assumptions with them, even while reality kept complicating those assumptions at every turn. There are many accounts of overlanders receiving practical help from native people, especially in locating routes, identifying fords, recovering stock, or trading food and goods. That is an important fact because later myth sometimes preferred a simpler story of constant threat. The historical picture is more tangled and more human. A wagon party with poor information might not have advanced safely without knowledge shared, sold, or signalled by people who already understood the country. Survival could hinge on knowing whom to ask, whom to observe, and whether pride would allow either, A striking little detail in some overland recollections is how fascinated emigrant children could be by native visitors to camp watching clothing hairstyles, horses' tools and gestures with the frank absorbing attention children give to anything unfamiliar. That curiosity could be open and immediate in a way adult behaviour often was not. Adults brought politics, rumour and inherited fears. Children sometimes brought questions, stares, and the sort of accidental honesty that makes everyone else suddenly very aware of themselves. Writers looking back do not all agree on how accurately emigrants understood the people they met. The answer, unsurprisingly, is not very accurately most of the time. Some travellers made earnest attempts at observation and even respect. Others filtered every encounter through fear, racial assumptions, or the self-flattering idea that they themselves were the central story of the continent. Many managed both at once, praising a guide's skill in one sentence and repeating ugly stereotypes in the next. Human beings are perfectly capable of depending on others while refusing to fully see them. Night intensifies this pattern because camp turns meetings into interpretation. If a group has traded successfully during the day, evening conversation may glow with relief. The fish was good. The route advice made sense. The horses looked fine. Perhaps someone remarks on clothing or horsemanship with genuine admiration. Then another voice introduces caution. Can they be trusted? Why were they watching the camp? Did that gesture mean anything? Did somebody take too close an interest in the livestock? And just like that, practical contact gets wrapped in speculation. Some of those fears came from real uncertainties in a world of language barriers, uneven power, contested territory, and the damage already being done by overland migration itself. Emigrant wagons brought disease, ecological strain, and the visible advance of settlement into land's indigenous communities had every reason to regard with alarm. So tension was not manufactured from nothing. But many emigrants failed to understand the larger context. They experienced their own fear vividly, while missing the reasons others might view the wagon road with equal or greater dread. Women often occupied a distinct position in these encounters. They participated in trade-watched, closely managed children, and sometimes recorded impressions in diaries that are more observant about clothing gestures, household objects, and the atmosphere of exchange than the reports men tended to leave. A woman at the fire might notice not only that people approached camp, but what they carried, how they looked at the children, whether the exchange felt easy or strained, whether her own body relaxed or stayed braced. Domestic perception becomes a kind of intelligence here. Children again could be both bridge and complication. A curious child might wander too near, stare too hard, or offer an item without understanding its value. An indigenous child and an emigrant child might look at one another with that frank, intense interest children reserve for possible playmates and possible mysteries. Meanwhile, the adults on both sides are busy carrying the full burden of history, danger, and caution. There is something poignant in that mismatch. The young often reach toward contact while the grown are busy measuring risk. One practical truth of the trail is that trade with indigenous people could be deeply important for emigrants short on food or information. Fish routes, berries, horses' guidance, and local knowledge were not abstract benefits. They could shape the next day's survival. To admit that does not romanticize the situation. It simply corrects the old frontier tale in which wagon families appear as self-sufficient heroes, descending from nowhere, with all wisdom already packed beside the flour barrel. In reality, they often learned by depending on people they did not fully understand and sometimes did not treat fairly. There is an odd and telling frontier habit visible in many accounts. Emigrants would remark on native knowledge with astonishment, as though it were surprising that people living on and with a land should know its water weather and routes better than newcomers. It is one of those moments where the historical record reveals its own blind spot without meaning to. The amazement says less about indigenous skill than about emigrant assumptions. Camp at night becomes the place where these blind spots harden or soften. One company may decide the day's encounter proved kindness and competence. Another, facing the same facts, may lean harder into suspicion, because suspicion fits the stories they brought from the East. People choose their narratives partly by temperament, partly by prior belief, partly by what outcome they need the world to have. The trail did not erase inherited prejudice. Often it simply put it into direct conversation with reality, and reality had a habit of being inconveniently mixed. The same traveller who feared attack might gratefully accept directions the next day. The same wagon party that traded at one river could panic at the sight of riders later on. Memory then did its own editing, emphasizing danger in some retellings, generosity in others, and confusion in the spaces between. That is why the nightly talk around the fire matters so much. It is where experience turns into story before the ink even dries. As you lie down after such a day, the camp feels tuned differently. People may be quieter, more alert, more full of interpretation than certainty. The fire throws weak gold over wagon wheels. The animals breathe nearby. Somewhere beyond the edge of camp, the land continues under stars that belong to no one family's narrative. You think of the faces seen that day, the traded goods, the gestures partly understood, the route advice repeated for tomorrow, the tension that sat beside courtesy and never fully left. And slowly you grasp something the trail keeps trying to teach, though many travellers resist learning it. You're not the sole actor in this story. Your fear is real, but it is not the only fear present. Your hopes are large, but they are not the only hopes crossing this ground. Out here in the long dark between campfire and dawn, that recognition can feel unsettling. It can also feel like the first honest step toward understanding what kind of world the Oregon Trail was actually moving through, and what it cost everyone when one people's road of promise cut across another people's home. Near the end, the nights begin to feel different, though not in the simple triumphant way you once imagined. Back in Missouri, if someone had told you that the final camps before Oregon would be glowing with easy cheer, warm gratitude, and the neat satisfaction of nearly completed effort, you might have believed them. That is the sort of lie distance tells beautifully. In truth, the last stretch carries its own peculiar exhaustion. By now the journey lives in your body. It has settled into your shoulders, your feet, your sleep, your patience, your habits of listening at night. You're closer to the Willamette Valley, closer to the promise that pulled you west, closer to the moment when movement may finally give way to settlement. And yet you are also worn, almost thin enough to see through. Camp after camp, the company begins to sense the end without quite trusting it. The road has taught everyone not to celebrate too soon. A river still needs crossing. A mountain path can still punish. An axle can still fail. A child can still wake feverish. One bad decision can still turn the final stretch into a private eternity. So hope now comes in a more cautious form. It no longer strides. It limps beside you and conserves energy. One well-supported point from emigrant accounts is that the last stages of the Oregon journey were often shaped by extreme fatigue, worn supplies, and a complicated mixture of anticipation and anxiety, rather than simple joy. By the time travellers neared their destination, animals were often weakened. Clothes were damaged, food stores thinned, and patience badly frayed. Arrival mattered profoundly, but nearing arrival did not magically restore comfort. It mostly revealed how much had been spent to get there. Evening on this last stretch has a strange tenderness to it. The routines are familiar now to the point of instinct. Blankets come out with practiced hands. Fires are built with less fuss. Supper, however, plain appears through motions repeated hundreds of times. People know where the cups are without looking. Children know the shape of camp before anyone explains it. A mother can settle bedding in near darkness. A father can judge the animals by sound before going to them. Trail life has become second nature just as it is about to end, which feels almost unfair. You notice too how quiet some people have become. Not unhappy exactly, simply inward. The long journey has stripped conversation down. There is less boasting now, less speculative grand talk about future prosperity, fewer cheerful declarations that everything ahead will obviously be better. The dream of Oregon remains, but it has been corrected by reality. Land will not plough itself. Houses will not spring up from hope. Winter will still arrive. Yet even this chastened vision can feel precious. You no longer want fantasy. You want a roof dry bedding and ground that will still belong to you in the morning. A charming little detail from emigrant memory is that some travellers began speaking more and more often about very ordinary future pleasures as they neared the end. Not abstract destiny, not national expansion, specific things, fresh milk, a real bed, bread from a proper oven, washing clothes in quantity, sleeping without having to find a camp spot first, hearing rain on an actual roof. These hopes have shrunk and deepened. That is one of the journey's finest edits to the human mind. It teaches you the scale of true luxury. There is still some disagreement among those who study trail narratives about whether nearing Oregon generally lifted spirits or made tempers worse. The written record suggests both. Some parties were buoyed by the nearing goal and newly alert to every sign of greener country. Others were so depleted by then that small irritations sparked quickly, and the emotional cost of one more hard day felt almost unbearable. Endings are often not graceful. They are simply final stretches in which tired people attempt to remain decent. Children feel the nearness of change in their own way. Some become excited at the thought of stopping for good, though they may not fully understand what good means. Others have adapted so thoroughly to movement that the idea of ending it seems abstract, almost suspicious. A child who has spent months sleeping near wagon wheels may hear grown people speak of houses and fields and react as if they are describing a fairy kingdom with better laundry options. Older children may dream of not walking tomorrow. Younger ones may only sense that the adults are charged with something, and that the camp air tastes different because of it, and still the nights remain nights. Hard ground does not soften merely because the destination is nearer. Dampness still settles where it pleases. Smoke still clings to cloth. Boots still need removing. Bodies still ache when lowered to the earth. If anything, the final camps can feel more emotional, precisely because the physical hardship has not let up. You're close enough to imagine stopping, which makes each remaining discomfort stand out more sharply. A last cold night can seem ruder than the 10th, because now you know what it is delaying. Women often carry a particular double burden here. They, like everyone, long for arrival, yet they also understand perhaps more concretely what arrival means in practical terms. Not pure rest, new labour, new domestic creation, the setting up of a household from almost nothing, cooking in unfamiliar conditions, managing children in a place not yet organised, assessing stores, washing everything, making a home where there is not one yet. So while some men may gaze ahead at land and opportunity, women often look ahead and see tasks already lining up politely at the door. There is one especially telling pattern in many trail recollections. As the journey neared its end, some emigrants grew more reflective about what had been lost along the way. Not only the dead, though, certainly them. Also, abandoned goods shed illusions, old versions of themselves, even relationships changed by the road. The nearing goal made accounting unavoidable. You had not simply travelled west. You had been altered in transit. The open sky, the bad nights, the hunger, the fear, the hard ground, the endless repetition of camp and dawn and camp again, all of it had rewritten you a little. And because of that, the final camps can feel unexpectedly precious. That may sound absurd after everything. After the mud, the insects, the cold, the bad water, the broken sleep, the smoke, the anxious rumours, the rain, creeping into blankets, The buffalo chip fires the children crying the graves by the road. Yet when an experience is almost over, even its hardship begins to glow strangely at the edges. You look at the fire and know there will soon come a last trail supper. You hear the oxen shifting and realize there will be a final night of their breathing beside your bedroll. You glance up at the stars through wagon bows and understand that the open sky, which has so often felt indifferent, has also become familiar. A practical note from emigrant life supports this emotional complexity. Many families arrived in Oregon not to immediate comfort, but to more work, temporary shelter, and the demands of beginning again. That meant the last trail camps were not simply the end of suffering and the start of ease. They were a threshold between one form of labour and another. No wonder people felt both eagerness and unease. Reaching a destination is not the same as inhabiting it. Tonight, as the company settles in one of these final camps, the conversation runs softer than before. Someone points out a feature of the country and says it looks promising. Someone else wonders quietly whether the grazing will hold tomorrow. A child asks how many more nights. No one gives a firm number because the trail has punished optimism often enough. Nearby, a woman folds a blanket with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times, and will soon perhaps do it no more. A man stares into the fire and sees a cabin, a field, a fence, or perhaps only stillness. Then one by one people lie down. The earth is still hard, the air is still cool, the fire still sinks red. But something has shifted. Not comfort, not yet. More like recognition. You've come very far. The camp knows it. The animals know it in their tired gait. The children know it in their changed faces. Your own body knows it in every scar of wear. And as you close your eyes beneath the same vast dark that has followed you all the way from Missouri, you feel that tomorrow or the day after soon enough to matter, and not soon enough to trust the long procession of nights outside may finally give way to walls, to settled ground, to Oregon, and to the uneasy miracle of being done. At last the trail begins loosening its grip on you, though it does not do so gently. There is no single clean moment when Oregon simply arrives and all hardship steps aside with a respectful bow. The end comes more like a long exhale after months of holding yourself together against weather distance, noise, hunger, and the hard, stubborn ground. The valleys grow more promising. The air shifts. The talk around camp changes from whether you'll make it to what sort of place might receive you when you do. Yet even now the road insists on one final lesson. Arrival is not the return of your old self. It is the unveiling of the person the journey has made. You feel that change most clearly at night. For so long darkness has meant chores, caution, discomfort, and the endless small calculations of outdoor living. Where is the driest patch? Is the fire high enough? Are the children warm? Did the stock settle? Is that cough worse? Will rain come? Has the blanket picked up more damp than warmth? Night after night the Oregon Trail has trained you to read the dark not as empty time between days, but as its own demanding country. And now, nearing the end, you discover that the open sky no longer feels entirely like an enemy. It has become familiar, stern perhaps, but known. That may be one of the truest things about long journeys. They do not merely carry you across land. They alter the meanings of ordinary things. A cup of hot coffee becomes wealth. A dry blanket becomes good fortune. A bed off the ground becomes nearly theological. Silence changes shape. So does noise. Even comfort, when it finally approaches, feels less like a right than a guest you hardly dare trust. A central fact of the overland story is that emigrants who reached Oregon often arrived depleted, changed, and very far from any polished image of triumphant frontier ease. They had worn down equipment, animal supplies, and parts of themselves. Many had buried companions or kin, abandoned goods, survived illness, or seen plans altered by sheer necessity. Reaching Oregon was a major achievement certainly, but it was not an instant reward sequence with cheerful music and conveniently healed feet. Most families arrived to more work, more adaptation, and the practical challenge of beginning a settled life in a place that was not yet home. That's why the final night or two on the trail can feel almost suspended. You look around camp and see not just the people you started with, but the people who remain, which is not always the same list. The young faces are leaner, the adults are quieter, even the jokes have changed. Early in the trip, humour often floated on optimism. Now it rests on experience. Someone says the ground tonight is almost comfortable, which means it is terrible but not personal. Someone else remarks that at least if it rains, there cannot be many more soaked bedrolls left in Destiny's budget. Tired laughter follows wiser than before. A lovely odd note from some emigrant memories is how vividly certain people remembered the first proper indoor sleep after arrival, not as one more comfort among many, but as a nearly disorienting event. A roof overhead could feel strange after so many months of exposure. Mattresses or bedsteads, when available, might seem too soft, almost suspicious. The body had learned the grammar of the trail so thoroughly that comfort itself needed a brief introduction. There is something deeply human in that. We adjust, then readjust, then marvel at how much we can normalize. Specialists who read the diaries and letters are not all persuaded that emigrants experienced a simple, emotional uplift upon arrival. Some writings glow with gratitude, relief, and awe at fertile country and the end of the journey. Others reveal anticlimax grief surfacing once movement stopped, or the sobering realization that the dream of Oregon still required labor money, shelter, and luck. That layered response feels right. When survival has been the main task for months, safety can arrive almost too quietly to recognize at first. The nights near the end are full of backward looking, not necessarily in grand speeches, more often in glances, half sentences, names suddenly mentioned, or the sight of an object that has somehow made it this far. A dented cup, a patched quilt, a child's toy that survived rain dust and rough packing, a knife once used by someone now gone. The camp becomes a museum of endurance without ever meaning to. Each thing that remains has outlasted something else. Women often seem to carry this transition with particular complexity. They have made camp livable night after night, turned open ground into temporary household-managed food children, mending sickness, and the thin continuity of ordinary life under extraordinary strain. So what does it mean when the camping may soon stop? Relief, certainly. But also the start of another great act of making. A home will not appear by sentiment alone. Beds must be arranged, stores unpacked, routines, rebuilt children steadied in a new place, and the immense invisible labour of settled life begun from near zero. The trail may be ending, but domestic creation is only changing address, men to face their own reckoning. The road has given them months of route choice, stock management, repair work, physical strain, and the burden of appearing equal to unpredictable danger. In Oregon, those responsibilities will not vanish. They will shift into fencing, building, ploughing, bargaining, and proving that the gamble west was worth its cost. The trail has tested endurance. Settlement will test judgment of a different kind. It is no wonder some men grow thoughtful near the end, staring at the fire as if it might offer strategic advice. Children are perhaps the strangest measure of change. They have grown on the road, some literally. Their clothes sit shorter. Their language has absorbed trail habits. They know how to gather fuel, how to stay near the wagons, how to sleep through animal noise and wake at a shouted name. For them, the moving camp may feel almost normal now. Oregon is something the adults speak about with great intensity, but childhood has been happening all along. They have played, cried, learned, and grown under the same open sky that exhausted everyone else. When the travelling stops, part of their world will end too, though they may not know enough yet to miss it. One well-attested part of arrival lore is that Oregon's greener country streams timber, and fertile valley land could seem astonishing after long months of plains dust and anxiety. Travellers wrote of the beauty with genuine feeling. That mattered because landscape had been not just scenery but ordeal. To see country that looked habitable, promising and richly productive was to glimpse the original dream again, this time with evidence. Yet beauty now met hardened eyes. The land had to prove itself in practical terms as well as picturesque ones. And still, when evening comes, on this last chapter of the road, the familiar motions return. Fire, supper, bedding, children, the animals breathing nearby. Smoke in your clothes, the stars overhead. You know how to do all of this without thinking now, which gives the camp a tender finality. Every object has its place, every hand knows its work. For months your life has been built from portable routines. Soon the routines may have walls around them again, and part of you cannot quite imagine it. You lie down and feel the ground beneath you with an intimacy born of repetition. This earth has been your mattress, your adversary, your nightly certainty. The dark above has been your ceiling, your threat, your wonder. You've hated them both at times. You have also learned them. The Oregon Trail has given you a new relationship to exposure itself. To sleep outside is no longer a theatrical frontier image. It is memory in the muscles. It is the feel of cool air on your face, the smell of smoke and canvas, the rustle of someone turning over a few feet away, the knowledge that morning will come because it always has. And perhaps that is the deepest change. You began this journey with ideas about courage that were probably a bit too shiny. You may have imagined courage as dramatic and obvious, a thing of river crossings, grand decisions and high speeches. The trail has corrected you. Courage, it turns out, is often quieter. It is getting children settled after a bad storm. It is mending a shirt by firelight when your hands ache. It is sleeping on hard ground for the 100th time and rising again before dawn. It is laughing over poor coffee. It is burying the dead and still feeding the living. It is learning how vast the world is and continuing through it anyway. So when Oregon finally lies close enough to feel real, you are not the same traveller who left independence beneath hopeful talk and untested bedding. You carry less illusion now, less vanity perhaps, fewer unnecessary possessions, a greater respect for weather, for women's work, for children's adaptability, for the intelligence of the land, for the body's limits, and its alarming ability to go beyond them. You have been thinned, seasoned, wearied, and remade under the open sky. Tonight the camp breathes more softly, the fire settles lower. Someone nearby speaks in a tired voice about tomorrow. A child turns in sleep. The animals stand quiet. Far above the stars remain as they were on the first night, though you are not. And as you close your eyes on one of the final outdoor sleeps of the journey, you feel the strange mingling of relief and reluctance that comes when hardship is nearly over. The ground is still hard. The blanket still smells of smoke. Yet the night has changed because you have changed. Oregon is close. The trail is almost behind you. And still, before it releases you fully, it gives one final gift, a deep and humbling knowledge of what it meant to live under the open dark and keep going west. The night now softens around you. The fire has dwindled into a gentle red glow, and the voices that once carried worry plans and the dull ache of tired bodies begin to fade into the hush. You are very near the end now, and there is nothing more required of you tonight except to rest inside this quiet moment. The wagon stands still. The blankets lie warm enough. The animals breathe somewhere close by, no longer alarming, only familiar part of the long rhythm that has carried you this far. Above you the sky stretches wide and calm, the same sky that watched over the first uncertain camp in Missouri, the same sky that looked down on storms, muddy crossings, whispered prayers, hard suppers, and all those nights when sleep came in fragments. Now it seems kinder somehow, or perhaps you have simply learned how to meet it without fear. The stars no longer feel like witnesses alone. They feel almost like companions. You think of all that has passed. The dust, the smoke, the children laughing and crying in the same hour, the fires lit from strange fuel, the cold mountain camps, the rivers crossed with shaking hands, the people who stayed beside you, and the ones who did not reach this final stretch. Memory drifts through you, gently now, no longer sharp, only tender. The trail has taken much, but it has also left you with a quieter strength, one that does not need to announce itself. Soon there will be roofs, walls, beds, fields, and the ordinary work of settled life. But for this last little while you are still here beneath the open sky, wrapped in the soft dark of the Oregon Trail, listening to the land grow still around you. The air cools, the embers dim, your breathing slows, and as the night carries you gently towards sleep, the long road behind you begins at last to fall silent. Sweet dreams,